Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story: The Follower in the Mirror. The antique mirror arrived unexpectedly. Amanda hadn't ordered it, nor had she ever seen it before, but the delivery man insisted it was hers. Her name was scrawled on the label in elegant, looping handwriting. She hesitated as the delivery man stood there, awkwardly holding the large object wrapped in thick brown paper. "I think there's a mistake," she said, frowning. The man shrugged. "I just deliver what's on the truck. If your name's on it, it's yours." Amanda sighed and let him place it in her living room. The mirror was heavy, its frame ornate and old-fashioned, carved with twisting vines and flowers. The dark wood gave it an air of something ancient, something that didn't belong in her small, modern apartment. "Maybe someone sent it as a gift," she muttered, peeling away the paper. The mirror gleamed underneath, its surface smooth and flawless. For a moment, she stared at her reflection, feeling a strange tug of unease. Her reflection looked normal: brown hair in a messy bun, tired eyes, an oversized sweatshirt, but something about it unsettled her. She chalked it up to the oddity of the situation. She left the mirror propped against the wall and went about her evening. The first night passed without incident, though Amanda felt a strange pull toward the mirror. It stood silently in the living room, catching glimpses of light as cars passed outside her window. She glanced at it every now and then, feeling its presence like a faint hum in the back of her mind. The next morning, she noticed something odd. As she walked past the mirror on her way to the kitchen, she could have sworn her reflection moved a fraction of a second too late. She stopped and stared at herself. The image in the glass stared back, perfectly still. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered, shaking her head. "You're just imagining things." But she couldn't shake the feeling. Later that day, as she was cleaning the apartment, Amanda caught herself glancing at the mirror over and over again. Every time, her reflection was just as it should be, mimicking her movements exactly. Still, a nagging sensation lingered, like an itch she couldn't scratch. That evening, as the sun set and the apartment grew dim, the mirror seemed to take on a different quality. Its surface shimmered faintly, as if the glass were rippling. Amanda turned on the lights, trying to push away the unease. She told herself it was just her imagination again. When she sat on the couch to relax, she found herself staring at the mirror without meaning to. Her reflection sat on the couch too, of course, but something about the way it looked at her felt off. "You're being paranoid," she said out loud, laughing nervously. But then the reflection smiled. Amanda froze. Her own lips hadn't moved, but the reflection was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile either. It was cold, calculated, and stretched too wide. "No," she whispered, her heart racing. "No, this isn't real." She rubbed her eyes and looked again. The reflection was back to normal, mirroring her terrified expression. Amanda didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she called her best friend, Jenna. "Something's wrong with me," Amanda said, pacing the apartment. "What do you mean?" Jenna asked, her voice crackling over the phone. I think I'm seeing things. There's this mirror that got delivered to me, and..." Amanda trailed off, unsure how to explain without sounding crazy. "It's just freaking me out." "A mirror? That's what's freaking you out?" Jenna laughed. "Maybe you're just stressed. Work's been rough on you lately, hasn't it?" Amanda sighed. "Yeah, maybe. Listen, I'll come over tonight. We'll watch a movie or something. Take your mind off it." "Thanks," Amanda said, feeling a small sense of relief. That evening, Jenna arrived with a bottle of wine and a bag of popcorn. They settled on the couch, a cheesy horror movie playing in the background. For a while, Amanda felt normal again, laughing with her friend and forgetting about the mirror. But then Jenna noticed it. "Hey, where'd you get that thing?" she asked, nodding toward the mirror. Amanda hesitated. It just showed up. I didn't buy it. Jenna frowned and stood up, walking over to inspect it. It's kind of creepy, isn't it? Feels like something out of a haunted house. Don't joke about that, Amanda said, shivering. Jenna glanced at her reflection, tilting her head. It's a little warped, don't you think? Like, the glass isn't perfectly flat. Amanda didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on Jenna's reflection, which seemed to be staring at Amanda instead of mirroring Jenna's movements. Stop, Amanda said suddenly, her voice sharp. Jenna turned around. What? What's wrong? Just don't look at it, Amanda said, her hands trembling. Jenna raised an eyebrow, but stepped away from the mirror. Okay, you're really freaking me out now. Are you sure you're okay? I don't know, Amanda admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. After Jenna left that night, the apartment felt suffocatingly quiet. Amanda avoided the living room, retreating to her bedroom and shutting the door tightly. But even there, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. The next few days were worse. Every time Amanda passed the mirror, she felt her reflection lingering a moment too long, its movements slightly out of sync. Sometimes she thought she saw it smiling again, but when she looked directly at it, the expression was gone. One morning, she woke up to find the mirror had moved. It was no longer against the living room wall, but standing in her bedroom, facing the bed. How did you get here? She whispered, her voice trembling. The mirror didn't answer, of course, but she swore she saw her reflection tilt its head slightly, as if mocking her fear. Amanda didn't know what to do. Her chest tightened as she stared at the mirror in her bedroom. She couldn't bring herself to touch it, not after everything she'd seen. Instead, she grabbed her phone and called Jenna again. Jenna, I need you to come over, she said, her voice shaking. What's going on? You sound terrible, Jenna replied. It's the mirror. It moved into my bedroom on its own. There was a pause. Amanda, that's not possible. Someone must have moved it. No one else is here, Amanda said, her voice breaking. Please just come over. I don't know what to do. Jenna sighed. All right, I'll be there in an hour. Just hang tight, okay? Amanda hung up and backed out of her bedroom, keeping her eyes on the mirror the entire time. She closed the door and locked it, as if that could stop whatever was happening. When Jenna arrived, Amanda practically dragged her inside. It's in my bedroom, Amanda said, her words tumbling out. Okay, let me see it, Jenna said, clearly skeptical. Amanda led her to the bedroom door and hesitated. It's not normal, Jenna. Just be careful. Jenna rolled her eyes. It's a mirror, Amanda. I'm sure it's fine. But when Amanda opened the door, Jenna froze. The mirror stood exactly where Amanda had left it, but something about it felt wrong, even to Jenna. The room seemed colder, the air heavier. Okay, that's weird, Jenna admitted. Amanda nodded. Do you believe me now? Jenna approached the mirror cautiously. It's just a piece of furniture, she said, though her voice wavered. She reached out to touch the frame. Don't! Amanda shouted, grabbing Jenna's arm. What? Why? Just don't touch it, Amanda said, her eyes wide. Jenna sighed and pulled her arm away. All right, fine. But Amanda, you can't keep living like this. If it's freaking you out this much, just get rid of it. I've thought about that, Amanda said. But what if it doesn't let me? Jenna gave her a confused look. It's a mirror. It doesn't get to decide. Amanda wasn't so sure. The two of them carried the mirror out of the bedroom, Jenna doing most of the heavy lifting while Amanda nervously glanced at the reflection. It was perfectly normal, showing their strained faces and tense movements. Let's put it in the hallway for now, Jenna said, setting it down against the wall. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Amanda nodded, though she didn't feel any better. The hallway felt darker now, the mirror casting a faint reflection of the dim light bulb overhead. Jenna stayed for a while, trying to reassure Amanda that everything was fine. They sat in the living room, talking about anything but the mirror. But Amanda couldn't focus. Her eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, where she could just barely see the edge of the mirror's frame. When Jenna finally left, Amanda felt the crushing weight of loneliness return. She closed the hallway door, trying to block out the mirror's presence. That night, she dreamed of her reflection. It stood in the mirror, smiling that awful, unnatural smile. Then it stepped out. Amanda woke with a start, her heart pounding. She sat up in bed, her eyes darting around the room. Everything was normal, or so it seemed. But then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The hallway door was closed. She knew she'd closed it, but the sound was unmistakable. Soft, deliberate steps, moving closer to her bedroom. Amanda reached for her phone, her hands shaking. She dialed Jenna's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Jenna, please call me back," Amanda whispered into the phone. "I think someone's in my apartment." She crept out of bed, grabbing a heavy book as her only weapon. Her feet barely made a sound on the carpet as she approached the bedroom door. She pressed her ear against it, straining to hear. Silence. Slowly, she unlocked the door and cracked it open. The hallway was dark, but she could see the outline of the mirror. It hadn't moved. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw her reflection. It was standing in the mirror, perfectly still, and it was staring directly at her, even though she wasn't looking into the glass. Amanda's breath hitched. She raised her hand, and the reflection didn't move. She stepped back, and it stayed where it was, its eyes locked on hers. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." The reflection's lips curled into that same sinister smile. Then it raised a hand and pointed at her. Amanda screamed, stumbling backward. She ran to the living room, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She grabbed her keys and bolted out of the apartment, not stopping until she was outside on the street. She stood there, gasping for air, her hands shaking uncontrollably. People passed by, giving her strange looks, but she didn't care. She couldn't go back inside. Amanda spent the night in her car, parked a few blocks away. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She kept checking her surroundings, half expecting to see her reflection standing outside the car, watching her. When morning came, Amanda forced herself to return to the apartment. She couldn't avoid it forever. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she felt a chill run down her spine. The mirror was back in the living room. Amanda froze in the doorway, her keys slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The sound echoed in the unnaturally still apartment. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the mirror. It stood there, innocently reflecting the room, but she knew better now. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I left it in the hallway. I didn't bring it here." She backed away slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her so badly she let out a small scream. She fumbled to pull it out, her fingers clumsy with fear. It was a text from Jenna. "Are you okay? I've been thinking about last night. Let me know if you need anything." Amanda hesitated before typing back. Her fingers hovered over the screen as her gaze flicked back to the mirror. The faint outline of her reflection was there, but she couldn't bring herself to meet its eyes. "It's back in the living room," she typed. "I didn't put it there. I don't know what to do." A reply came almost immediately. "I'm coming over." Relief washed over Amanda, but it was short-lived. She couldn't wait for Jenna, not with that thing in her apartment. She needed to do something, anything, to take control of the situation. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Amanda approached the mirror. Her steps were hesitant, and her palms were clammy. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see her reflection more clearly. At first, everything seemed normal. Her reflection mirrored her movements, her wide eyes and trembling hands. But then it tilted its head slightly to the side, a gesture Amanda hadn't made. Her stomach twisted into knots. "What do you want?" she whispered. The reflection's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. Amanda's breath hitched. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The reflection raised a hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. The movement was fluid, almost graceful, as if the barrier between them was nothing more than a thin sheet of air. Amanda took a step back, her chest heaving. You can't come out," she stammered. "You stay in there." The reflection's smile widened. Then, to Amanda's horror, it spoke. "You let me in," it said, its voice a twisted echo of her own. Amanda staggered backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. "No," she gasped. "I didn't." But before she could finish, the mirror began to ripple, the glass shifting and distorting as though it were liquid. Amanda's reflection blurred and warped, its smile stretching unnaturally wide. Amanda turned and ran, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She darted into the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife she could find. She didn't know what good it would do against a mirror, but she felt better with it in her hand. The sound of footsteps echoed from the living room. Amanda froze, clutching the knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. The footsteps weren't hers. Slowly, she peeked around the corner. The mirror stood where she had left it, but the reflection was gone. Amanda's blood ran cold. She backed into the kitchen, her mind racing. Was it behind her? Was it hiding somewhere in the apartment? Her pulse thundered in her ears as she scanned the room, her grip on the knife tightening. Then she saw it. A shadow moved across the floor, just barely visible out of the corner of her eye. Amanda spun around, holding the knife out in front of her. "Stay away from me," she shouted, her voice trembling. But there was no one there. A cold breeze brushed against the back of her neck, making her shiver. She turned again, her eyes darting frantically around the room. "I know you're here," she said, her voice cracking. "Show yourself." A low, guttural laugh echoed through the apartment, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Amanda's heart skipped a beat. The voice returned, dripping with malice. "You can't run from me, Amanda. I'm already inside." Amanda screamed, slashing at the air with the knife. The laughter grew louder, filling the room like a swarm of buzzing insects. She bolted for the front door, her only thought to escape. But as she reached for the handle, the door wouldn't budge. It felt as though it were glued shut. "Let me out," she cried, pounding on the door with her fists. The laughter abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Amanda turned slowly, her back pressed against the door. The mirror was standing in the hallway, even though she hadn't moved it. Its surface was no longer smooth and reflective. Instead, it looked like a dark, bottomless void, and something was stepping out of it. Amanda's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor. Her knife clattered beside her, forgotten. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure emerging from the mirror. It looked like her, but it wasn't. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its twisted smile was far too wide. "What are you?" Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, mimicking her earlier movements. "I'm you," it said, its voice distorted and echoing. "The real you." Amanda shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, you're not me." The figure took a step closer, its smile never faltering. "You can't hide from the truth, Amanda. You brought me here. You let me in." Amanda pressed her back harder against the door, her trembling hands searching desperately for the knob behind her. She wanted to run, to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure advanced slowly, its movements eerily calm, as though it had all the time in the world. "I didn't let you in," Amanda whispered, her voice quivering. "You're lying." The figure's laughter was cold and hollow, like the sound of wind whistling through a crack. "You've been inviting me in for weeks. Every glance, every thought, every fear. I've been waiting." Amanda's mind raced. How had it come to this? She thought of every time she'd lingered in front of the mirror, every moment she'd questioned her own reflection. Had she really been opening a door all this time? No, she said firmly, trying to steady her voice. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for you. The figure's smile faltered for the first time, and its glowing eyes narrowed. You can deny it all you want, it hissed, but I am a part of you now. You can't undo what's been done. Amanda gritted her teeth and forced herself to stand. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she clenched her fists and took a shaky step forward. You're not real, she said, her voice growing steadier. You're just in my head. The figure tilted its head again, mocking her movements. Am I? It asked. Without warning, it lunged forward, its distorted hand reaching out to grab her. Amanda screamed and dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. She scrambled to her feet and grabbed the knife she'd dropped earlier. Stay back, she shouted, holding the blade out in front of her. The figure paused, its glowing eyes fixed on the knife. Then it smiled again, a slow, menacing grin. Do you really think that will stop me? It asked, taking another step forward. Amanda's grip tightened on the handle. I don't care what you are, she said through clenched teeth. You're not staying here. Get out of my house. The figure laughed, a deep, echoing sound that made Amanda's skin crawl. This isn't your house anymore, it said. It's mine, and soon you won't even exist. Amanda's stomach twisted at the words, but she refused to back down. She lunged forward, slashing at the figure with the knife. The blade passed through it as though it were made of smoke, and Amanda stumbled, nearly losing her balance. The figure didn't even flinch. It reached out and grabbed her wrist, its touch icy and numbing. Amanda cried out in pain as the cold spread through her arm, making her fingers go limp. The knife fell to the floor with a dull clatter. Let me go, she shouted, struggling against its grip. The figure leaned in close, its glowing eyes inches from hers. You can't fight me, it said softly. I am you. Amanda shook her head violently, her tears blurring her vision. No, she choked out. You're not me. You're not me. With a burst of adrenaline, she wrenched her arm free and stumbled backward. Her hand hit the side table, knocking over a lamp. The light bulb shattered as it hit the floor, plunging the room into near darkness. The figure stood still, its glowing eyes the only source of light. It watched her with a predatory intensity, as though waiting for her next move. Amanda's mind raced. She couldn't fight this thing physically, that much was clear. But if it was tied to her reflection, maybe the key to defeating it was in the mirror itself. Her eyes darted to the hallway, where the mirror still stood. The surface had returned to its reflective state, and she could see the faint outline of the figure in its depths. Gathering her courage, Amanda bolted for the mirror. The figure let out an enraged scream and lunged after her, its footsteps pounding against the floor. Amanda reached the mirror and grabbed it with both hands, her fingers trembling. If you came from here, she said through gritted teeth, then you can go back. The figure's hands clawed at her shoulders, trying to pull her away. Its touch burned like ice, sending shocks of pain through her body. Amanda screamed, but she didn't let go of the mirror. She stared into the glass, her reflection blurred and distorted by the struggle. You're not real, she shouted. You don't belong here. The surface of the mirror began to ripple again, and the figure let out a guttural howl. Its grip on Amanda loosened, and she seized the opportunity to shove it backward with all her strength. The figure stumbled, its body twisting unnaturally as it fell toward the mirror. Its glowing eyes widened in shock as its form was sucked back into the glass, its screams echoing through the apartment. Amanda watched in horror as the surface of the mirror rippled violently, the figure's distorted face appearing one last time before disappearing into the depths. Then, everything went still. The mirror returned to its normal state, reflecting only Amanda's pale, tear-streaked face. She staggered backward, her legs giving out beneath her. For a long moment, she sat on the floor, staring at the mirror in stunned silence. The apartment was eerily quiet, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Amanda's chest heaved as she tried to calm herself. Her hands were shaking, and her entire body ached from the struggle. She wanted to believe it was over, but a nagging voice in the back of her mind told her otherwise. Slowly, she stood and approached the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, perfectly synchronized with her movements. But as Amanda reached out to touch the glass, her reflection's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. Amanda stumbled back from the mirror, her heart hammering in her chest. She rubbed her eyes, hoping she'd imagined it, but when she looked again, her reflection was perfectly still, mimicking her every move. For a moment, she stood frozen in place, staring at herself. Her mind screamed for her to run, to leave the apartment and never look back, but her feet refused to move. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on her like a weight. "You can't trust it," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "It's not over." The sound of her own voice startled her, breaking the suffocating silence. She turned away from the mirror and began pacing the room, her thoughts racing. What had she done? Had she truly trapped the thing in the mirror, or had she only made it angrier? The faintest sound, like the creak of old wood, stopped her in her tracks. She whipped around, her eyes darting to the mirror. It sat quietly against the wall, reflecting the dimly lit room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. "Don't look at it," she muttered, forcing herself to turn away. But the urge to glance back was overwhelming. It felt like an invisible hand was tugging at her, drawing her gaze toward the mirror. She clenched her fists and bit her lip, trying to resist. Another creak echoed through the apartment, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from the hallway. Amanda's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes narrowing. The hallway was dark, the light bulb having burned out earlier. She reached for her phone on the coffee table, turning on the flashlight. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty hallway. Still, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her phone buzzed suddenly in her hand, making her jump. She looked down at the screen, her stomach dropping when she saw the notification. "Incoming video call, unknown caller." Amanda's thumb hovered over the decline button, but something compelled her to answer. Her hands trembled as she accepted the call, her breath catching in her throat. The screen lit up, showing a live feed of her apartment, her exact location, as though someone were filming her from behind. "No," she whispered, spinning around. There was no one there. Her reflection in the mirror caught her eye. It stood perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Amanda's phone slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The reflection smiled again, wider this time. Slowly, it raised its hand and pressed its palm against the glass. Amanda's chest tightened as she watched. Her own hands were at her sides, but the reflection didn't mimic her. It began to move, tapping the glass rhythmically, as though trying to communicate. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed through the room, even though Amanda knew it shouldn't be possible. She backed away, her legs bumping against the edge of the couch. "What do you want from me?" she cried out, her voice breaking. The reflection stopped tapping and tilted its head, as though considering her question. Then it lifted its hand and pointed directly at Amanda. She shook her head violently. "No, I'm not playing your game. You can't control me." The reflection's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure malice. It pressed both hands against the glass, its body pushing forward as though trying to break through. Amanda turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the floor. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to get away. She reached the front door and yanked it open, only to stop dead in her tracks. The hallway outside her apartment was gone. In its place was a dark, endless void. "What?" she whispered, stepping back. The door slammed shut on its own, the force nearly knocking her off her feet. Panicking, Amanda ran to the nearest window and threw back the curtains. The city skyline she'd grown so used to was no longer there. Instead, she saw a dense, swirling fog, so thick it obscured everything beyond a few feet. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled away from the window. "This isn't real. This can't be real," she said, clutching her head. A soft chuckle echoed through the room, low and menacing. Amanda froze, her blood turning to ice. "You can't run," a voice whispered. It sounded like her own, but distorted, as though it were coming from deep underwater. Slowly, she turned back toward the mirror. Her reflection was gone. The glass shimmered, and the surface began to ripple like water. A hand emerged, pale and clawed, followed by an arm, then a head. Amanda screamed as the figure pulled itself through the mirror, its eyes glowing with a sickly light. It smiled at her, its teeth sharp and gleaming. "You open the door," it said, its voice a chilling echo. "Now you'll see what's on the other side." Amanda backed away from the mirror, her heart thundering in her chest. The figure emerged fully from the glass, standing tall and motionless, its glowing eyes locked on hers. Its smile was twisted, inhuman, stretching across its face in a way that no person's smile ever should. Her breath hitched as she tried to retreat further, but the room seemed to close in on her, the walls pushing forward, the space narrowing. She felt as though the very air was thickening around her, as if the apartment itself was alive and conspiring against her. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no." The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, each step seeming to distort the air around it. Its body was vaguely human, but its skin was ashen and cracked, like stone weathered by centuries of neglect. As it moved, a strange, eerie sound echoed from it, a low, hollow hum, like the mournful call of some distant creature. "I'm not afraid of you," Amanda said, trying to steady her breath, but the words felt hollow in her own mouth. The fear was consuming her. Her hands trembled, her legs felt weak, but she couldn't let it see her break. "You should be," the figure replied, its voice like ice scraping against metal. "You've invited me in, and now you'll never escape." Amanda's pulse raced, and she quickly glanced around the room for anything she could use to defend herself. Her gaze landed on the broken lamp, its shattered pieces scattered on the floor. She grabbed the jagged edge of a piece of glass, clutching it in her trembling hand. "Stay away from me," she shouted, holding it out in front of her. The reflection, that thing, didn't flinch. It just stared at her with its glowing eyes, its mouth widening into an even more grotesque grin. "You can't stop what's already begun," it said, its voice like 1,000 whispers all at once. "You've opened the door, and once it's opened, there's no going back." Amanda's mind was racing. She had to think. She had to get away, get out of this nightmare. The mirror, the reflection, the figure, none of it made sense. But it didn't matter. She had to survive. With all the strength she could muster, she lunged for the front door, desperate to escape. She threw herself against it, pounding her fist against the wood, but the door didn't budge. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, holding her in place. The figure laughed, a sound like cracking glass. "You can't leave," it said, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You're mine now." Amanda's pulse raced, and for a moment, she felt completely trapped. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She was suffocating in the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of her own apartment, with no way out. The reflection moved closer, its face twisting into something unrecognizable, its smile turning into something monstrous. "You should have never looked," it whispered. "You should have never asked." Amanda's hands found the edge of the door again, and she pulled with all her might. She screamed, her voice ragged, the panic surging through her. "I won't be yours. I won't be yours." The door slammed open with a sudden force, sending her stumbling back. The world beyond the apartment was as dark and unfamiliar as the reflection in the glass. Without thinking, Amanda bolted forward, her feet pounding against the cold floor as she fled into the hallway. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay here. She couldn't let that thing, it catch her. As she ran, she could feel the figure behind her, like a shadow creeping at the edges of her vision. The air seemed to thicken around her, pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. Her legs burned, and her mind screamed at her to stop, to think, but all she could do was run. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of her, the walls closing in with every step she took. She turned corner after corner, but nothing looked familiar. It was as though the very building had transformed into something alien, shifting and warping with each movement she made. Finally, she reached a stairwell. She grabbed the railing and pulled herself upward, her body aching with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let that thing catch her. She reached the top floor and looked around. The hallway was dim, its lights flickering erratically. The air smelled musty, like the forgotten corners of an old building. "Where am I?" Amanda muttered, barely able to keep herself steady on her feet. Her mind was spinning. She needed to get out. She needed to escape. As she turned, she caught a glimpse of something at the end of the hall. Her heart stopped. It was her reflection. She could see herself, her, not the figure, standing at the end of the hallway, staring at her with that same wide, twisted smile. The reflection's eyes glowed faintly, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide. "No," Amanda gasped, backing away. But it wasn't just her reflection. As she turned, she realized there were multiple reflections now, scattered throughout the hallway. They moved, they shifted, and they all stared at her, their eyes glowing with malice. A dozen figures, each one a twisted version of herself, each one grinning that same horrific smile. "No, no!" Amanda screamed, turning to flee. But the reflections began to advance toward her, stepping out from the walls, following her every move. She reached the end of the hall and turned, stumbling into another hallway, but it was the same. The walls stretched, the floors warped, and the figures kept coming, their footsteps echoing in unison. She could hear their voices now, all of them whispering in unison, "You're mine, you're mine, you're mine." The door to a nearby apartment flew open with a force that made Amanda gasp. She didn't hesitate. She ran inside, slamming the door behind her. The apartment was empty, but it was familiar. It was hers. Her reflection was waiting for her inside. And it wasn't alone. Amanda backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath ragged. She tried to focus, but her mind was a blur of panic, her thoughts racing like 1,000 whispers she couldn't escape. She couldn't think straight. She couldn't breathe. The weight of the reflections closing in on her crushed any chance of clarity. The apartment looked like her own, but something was wrong. The furniture was arranged differently. The walls seemed darker, the shadows longer. The air felt heavy, as if she was wading through thick, damp fog. She looked around desperately, but her eyes kept returning to the mirror. There it stood, no longer just a reflection, it was a presence. The glass shimmered, distorted, like the surface of a pond rippling with an unseen force. Her reflection no longer mimicked her movements, it anticipated them. It stood motionless, its eyes locked on her, waiting. And then it smiled again. Amanda turned, her feet carrying her into the apartment's living room, but the walls seemed to press in on her. The space was shrinking, closing in, suffocating her. She ran to the window, but when she looked out, she saw nothing but that same impenetrable fog, stretching endlessly. There was no escape. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking as she backed away from the window. "This can't be real." But it was. It was real. She could feel it. The apartment was now a prison, its walls closing tighter with every passing moment. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, the temperature dropping rapidly. Her breath came in visible clouds. What had she done? She had opened the door, invited it in, and now there was no turning back. The figure, the reflection, it wasn't just an intruder. It was a part of her, a shadow cast from the darkest corners of her mind. And as the figure stepped closer to her reflection, she realized the awful truth. It had been waiting for this moment all along. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. She couldn't look away from the thing that was her, yet wasn't. The reflection spoke. Its voice was her own, but colder, twisted, like the echoes of some faraway nightmare. Because you wanted me here. Every time you doubted yourself, every time you wished to be someone else, I grew stronger. You brought me to life. Amanda staggered back, her hands shaking. I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this. The reflection tilted its head, its eyes gleaming with a terrifying understanding. You did, though. I am the version of you couldn't face. I am everything you buried deep inside yourself. The fear, the anger, the loneliness. Amanda's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, her hands clutching her head as the weight of its words pressed down on her like a physical force. No, I didn't. I didn't want this. But the reflection just kept watching her. You did, and now you're mine. Tears streamed down her face as she curled into herself, trying to block out the voice. But it was inside her head now, speaking directly to her thoughts. She couldn't escape it. The apartment was spinning. Her reflection moved toward her in the glass, its body twisting unnaturally, contorting as though it were fighting to break free from the confines of the mirror. It reached out, its fingers stretching toward her, its smile widening, and then it was there with her. Amanda screamed as the reflection's hand pressed against her cheek. The contact was cold like ice, and it burned, searing through her skin. The reflection's fingers dug into her flesh, pulling her toward the mirror, toward it. The part of herself she'd never wanted to acknowledge, the part of herself that now wanted to consume her whole. No! Amanda cried out, clawing at her face, trying to pull away, but it was too strong. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was here, in her mind, in her body, in every corner of the room. I am you, the reflection whispered, its voice low and gravelly, its breath like a cold wind against her skin. You can't run from me. With one final, desperate scream, Amanda pushed back with every ounce of strength she had. The world around her blurred as she felt herself being pulled toward the mirror, her body twisting unnaturally. But as her hand brushed against the glass, a sudden force sent her crashing to the floor. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she fought against the suffocating panic. The reflection was gone. She sat on the floor, trembling, staring at the mirror. It was empty now, nothing but her reflection. She looked at herself in the glass, but it was still wrong. Something was there, lurking beneath the surface, something that wasn't quite her. She stared at the reflection, her heart pounding in her chest. Her reflection stared back, but there was something in its eyes now, something empty, a hollow, unnatural void. Get out of my head, Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible. Please, just leave me alone. But the reflection didn't answer. It didn't need to. Amanda slowly stood, her body trembling, her legs weak. She backed away from the mirror, not taking her eyes off it for a second. She wanted to run, to get as far away as possible, but she knew that wherever she went, it would follow. The reflections would always follow. And so, Amanda turned and walked to the door, her every step feeling like it was drawing her deeper into the nightmare. She opened the door, the hallway stretching before her in endless darkness. The same oppressive weight pressed down on her as before, and she could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind her, like someone or something was following her. Please no, she whispered, backing away. I can't do this. I can't. But as she looked down the hall, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, at the far end of the corridor, stood her reflection. It was smiling at her. Amanda's heart hammered in her chest as she stood frozen in the doorway, her hands still clutching the doorknob. Her reflection stood at the far end of the hallway, grinning, its eyes glowing with that same cold, unholy light. But this time, it wasn't just standing there. It was moving. Each step it took echoed through the silent apartment building, a hollow sound that seemed to reverberate off the walls, closing in on Amanda. The slow, deliberate way it moved made her blood run cold, like it was savoring the fear building inside her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. The terror was paralyzing, a deep, suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. The reflection didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its eyes were filled with an eerie promise, and Amanda knew what it wanted. It wanted her to stay. It wanted her to face it, to let it consume her entirely. "No," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. She could feel it closing in, feel its presence in every crevice of the apartment. There was no escape. She backed further into the apartment, her eyes never leaving the thing that was her and yet wasn't. The grin it wore was almost hungry, as if it had been starved for this moment, as if it had been waiting for her to break. With every step it took toward her, Amanda's mind spiraled further into chaos. She couldn't think clearly. She couldn't focus. It was as if the very air around her was suffocating her thoughts, twisting them into something dark and foreign. Her vision blurred, the edges of reality bending like the reflection in the glass. She stumbled backward, her foot hitting something on the floor, one of the chairs that had been overturned earlier. Her breath caught in her throat as she nearly fell, but she managed to catch herself against the wall. "Stay away from me," she shouted, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. But the reflection didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. It continued to approach, its footsteps echoing louder now, the sound growing deeper, more sinister with each passing second. Her mind raced. What could she do? She had to do something. The knife. There was a kitchen knife on the counter. It was the only thing she could think of. She could use it, maybe drive it through the reflection, maybe. But the reflection was already at the door. It stepped into the room with a slow, deliberate motion, its eyes fixed on Amanda. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice caught in her chest. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, frozen in place by the sheer weight of the thing in front of her. The reflection tilted its head, as if examining her, its smile stretching impossibly wide. "There's nowhere left to run," it whispered in that same chilling voice. "You can't escape yourself." Amanda's breath quickened, her mind racing. There had to be a way. She had to find a way out. She glanced around the room once more, her eyes landing on the large mirror opposite her, the one that had started this whole nightmare. The reflection there, still grinning, watching, was no longer a mere imitation. It was a predator, and Amanda, trapped in this apartment, was its prey. In a burst of desperation, Amanda dashed toward the mirror, throwing herself in front of it. She grabbed the edge of the frame, her fingers slipping against the cold glass. The reflection in the mirror seemed to warp as her hands touched it, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. "Let me out," she begged, her voice raw with desperation. "Let me out, please." But it was no use. As her fingers dug into the glass, the mirror seemed to grow colder, the surface warping and contorting. It was like the mirror was trying to swallow her whole. Amanda could feel it pulling at her, the glass dragging at her skin, drawing her in, inch by inch. The reflection's voice echoed in her mind. "You don't belong here. You never did." Tears blurred her vision as Amanda fought against the force pulling her closer. Her reflection was no longer just a figure. It was a being, a twisted version of herself that wanted to consume her entirely, to replace her. She cried out as the glass pressed against her skin, cold and unyielding. With all her strength, she pushed away, but it was like trying to push through a wall of ice. The more she struggled, the more the glass seemed to eat her. "No," she gasped, her breath shallow, her limbs trembling. "Please let me go." But the reflection was getting closer. Its eyes, glowing like twin coals, were locked on hers. The grin spread wider, and Amanda knew in that moment that it wasn't just about her reflection anymore. It was about the part of herself she had locked away, the anger, the fear, the darkness that had been festering inside her. It was the part of her that had been waiting to break free. It was here, and it wasn't going anywhere. Amanda stumbled back from the mirror, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Her reflection was moving closer, its smile so wide now it seemed to swallow its own face. "You can't run anymore," it whispered, its voice distorted, deepened, the words feeling like cold fingers pressing against her spine. Amanda closed her eyes, clutching her head, trying to block out the sound, the sight, the feeling of that thing, that other her closing in. But when she opened her eyes again, it was standing directly in front of her. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was real, and it was smiling, its teeth gleaming in the dim light, its eyes gleaming with malice. Amanda froze, her eyes locked with the thing before her, her reflection now so close she could feel the cold emanating from it. It wasn't just mirroring her, it had become her, or at least the part of her that she had feared for so long. The darkness she had buried deep within, the fear, the anger, the loneliness, it was all here, wearing her face, smiling with a cruelty that made her heart stop. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with an unnatural chill. Amanda's legs felt like jelly, and her head spun as she struggled to understand what was happening. How was this possible? The thing before her moved closer, its smile widening, its eyes gleaming with a sinister joy. "You thought you could hide from me," it said in her voice, but twisted darker. "You thought you could bury me and keep me locked away." Amanda's chest tightened, her breath shallow. The reflection wasn't just standing there anymore. It was alive, a thing that moved and spoke, that wanted something from her. The terror that gripped her was unlike anything she had ever known. "You're not me," Amanda gasped, stepping backward, but the reflection moved with her, matching every step, every breath. "I'm everything you are," it whispered, leaning in so close that she could feel its cold breath on her skin. "And I always have been. You can't escape me." Amanda felt the words sink into her bones, filling her with a kind of despair that threatened to swallow her whole. How could she fight something that was her? How could she escape a part of herself that she had never known how to control? "No," Amanda whispered, shaking her head, her hands pressing against her temples as if trying to shut the voice out. "I'm not you. I'm not like you." But the reflection laughed, the sound hollow and mocking, like the echo of her own fear. "You're not fooling anyone. You've always known I was here, in the dark corners of your mind. I've been with you since the beginning, waiting, watching. And now I get to take everything from you." The laughter was too much. It filled her ears, rattling her thoughts, making everything feel like it was spinning out of control. The room around her seemed to warp and twist, like the very walls were closing in, bending toward her in slow, deliberate movements. Amanda stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the apartment, searching for anything that could help her. But there was nothing but the suffocating presence of her own reflection. "I won't let you do this," Amanda gasped, her voice trembling. "You don't have a choice," it said, its voice suddenly soft, like a whisper in the dark. "You let me in. You invited me here. And now, I'm going to take everything from you. Every memory, every thought, every part of you that you've tried so hard to hide. And when I'm done, I will be you." Amanda felt her legs give out, and she collapsed to the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. The room spun around her, the walls closing in, the mirror taunting her with its twisted, dark version of herself. It was too much, too overwhelming. The reflection had become more than just an image. It was a force, a dark presence that was consuming her, pulling her deeper into its world, its reality. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could only stare at the reflection, whose smile grew even wider, more malicious. Its eyes were filled with something far worse than anger. There was a hunger in them. Amanda's mind screamed for release, for freedom. But there was no escape. Not from herself. Not from the thing she had become. "You can't hide from me," it whispered again, its voice now a soft, twisted lullaby. "I am you." Amanda's vision blurred as the terror overwhelmed her. The room was closing in, her breath quick and shallow, her thoughts a jumbled mess of panic and fear. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. She couldn't fight. And then, in that moment of pure, paralyzing fear, she realized something terrible. It was her. The reflection, the thing that had haunted her, was a part of her. A part of herself she had never wanted to acknowledge, never wanted to face. But now there was no running from it, no hiding. The thing bent down in front of her, its face inches from hers, its eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. "I've been waiting for this," it said, its voice almost tender. "Waiting for you to accept me, to accept yourself." Amanda gasped, her chest heaving, but all she could hear was the sound of her reflection's voice echoing in her mind, the words that she could never escape. "I am you," it whispered again. The last shred of resistance inside Amanda snapped. She couldn't fight anymore. She couldn't run. She had been lost to the reflection, swallowed whole by the darkness that had been growing inside her. And when she looked into the glass again, she saw it. Her face, but not her. The reflection, grinning, dark eyes watching her, her smile now twisted into something unrecognizable. The world around her faded into the darkness, and Amanda realized, with chilling clarity, that there was no longer any difference between her and the thing in the mirror. There was no escaping herself. Amanda's mind felt like it was shattering into pieces, each one splintering away from the whole of who she had been. Her reflection, it was no longer just a distorted version of her. It was her now. It was the real Amanda, the one who had been hiding behind a facade all this time. The thing in the mirror had won. For what seemed like an eternity, Amanda couldn't move. She was paralyzed by the sight of herself, the real her, standing across from her. The grin stretched wider, pulling her features into something grotesque, something unrecognizable. Her reflection, her, was everything she had suppressed, the anger, the resentment, the fear, and the darkness. As the seconds passed, she felt herself slipping. She couldn't tell if she was still in the apartment or if she had crossed into the mirror itself. The air was thick, suffocating, and she felt as though she was drowning in it. The reflection's smile never faltered. It reached out a hand, its fingers curling with eerie grace. And for a moment, Amanda felt something deep within herself stir. No, she thought. No, I can fight this. I can fight me. But even as she thought it, her body refused to move. Her arms hung limply by her sides, her legs frozen, her chest locked in place by the crushing weight of her own fear. The reflection's hand came closer, its fingers brushing against her cheek, and Amanda flinched as though she had been burned. "Don't fight me," it whispered, its voice both soft and commanding. "You're only delaying the inevitable." The coldness of its touch seeped into her skin, like an icy current crawling through her veins. Amanda gasped, feeling the chill invade her very core, freezing her insides, numbing her mind. The reflection leaned in closer, its eyes filled with something dark and knowing. "You've always known this was coming," it said, its voice now a low, mocking whisper. "You just refused to face it. Now, you have no choice. I am you. You are me." Amanda's vision blurred again, the world around her becoming a swirling mix of colors and shadows. The air seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on her from all sides. The reflection in front of her was no longer just a mirror image. It was real. It was alive, and it was replacing her. With every breath she took, it felt like the reflection was pulling her in deeper. She could feel herself slipping away, her body becoming heavy, her thoughts growing hazy, like she was being consumed by the very darkness that had once only haunted her nightmares. The mirror no longer felt like a separate world. It was a prison. The thing in the mirror smiled wider, its teeth gleaming in the dim light. "There's no escape, Amanda. You are me now. And soon, no one will remember who you were." Amanda's breath quickened, panic bubbling up inside her. She wanted to scream, to fight, to claw her way out of this nightmare, but all she could do was stand there, frozen, as the reflection took everything from her. Her mind, her memories, the very essence of who she had been. They were slipping away piece by piece. She could feel herself fading into the background, her identity merging with the twisted version of herself that stood before her. The reflection was swallowing her whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the reflection's smile faltered. Amanda blinked. Her breath caught in her throat. The smile, the grin, it was gone. The thing before her, stared back at her with wide, empty eyes, its face now twisted with confusion, almost like it hadn't expected this. The eerie, cold grip on her heart loosened just slightly, and for the briefest moment, Amanda felt a flicker of hope. Could it be? Could she still fight it? She took a shaky breath, willing her legs to move, to step away, to escape. The reflection didn't follow her this time. It didn't mimic her movements. It just stood there, watching her, its expression darkening with each passing second. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she took another step back, her mind racing, her body moving with a newfound urgency. She wasn't sure how, but something was changing. The reflection's control over her was weakening. But just as she thought she might escape, she heard it. A whisper, no, a voice. You can't leave me. You can't run from yourself. The voice was hers, but distorted, twisted beyond recognition. It echoed through her mind, reverberating in the empty space between her ears. She turned toward the mirror again, her pulse racing as she saw the reflection begin to smile once more. No, please, Amanda gasped, her hands reaching out, her fingers brushing against the glass as if trying to hold herself back. But the reflection was already moving toward her, its pace slow, deliberate. The grin returned, more dangerous than before. You will never escape me, it whispered. I am your shadow. I am your dark side. And you belong to me now. Amanda's fingers pressed harder against the glass, the cold biting into her skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she fought to keep her composure, but the reflection was relentless. It reached for her, its hand coming through the mirror. And then in an instant, everything went black. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as the darkness swallowed her whole. For a moment, there was nothing but the deafening silence, the absence of everything she had ever known. She couldn't see. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. It felt as though she had been suspended in time, trapped in the space between one world and the next. Her thoughts were a swirling mess, her mind spinning in a frenzy of confusion. The terror, the helplessness, everything she had felt up until that point was now amplified 100-fold. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the darkness began to fade. Light, dim and flickering, began to pierce the void, and Amanda's eyes fluttered open. She was no longer in the apartment, no longer in the world she had known. She stood in a place that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien, a hallway of mirrors. The walls stretched endlessly in either direction, each one lined with mirrors, their reflective surfaces shimmering with a cold, ghostly light. She could see herself in every one of them, all of her, the twisted, malevolent version that had haunted her for so long, standing beside her, smiling that dark, cruel smile. "Where am I?" Amanda whispered, her voice shaky and small in the vast emptiness. The reflection in front of her didn't respond with words. Instead, it reached out, its hand slipping through the glass of one of the mirrors. The fingers curled, and suddenly, Amanda felt the weight of them pressing down on her chest, like invisible hands were squeezing the breath from her lungs. "No," she gasped, stepping back, her heart racing. "Please, no." But it was too late. The reflection was already inside her mind, twisting everything she had ever known. She could feel it, like an insidious presence, a shadow that wrapped around her thoughts and pulled them into the depths of her fear. "You can't run from me," the reflection whispered in her ear, its voice a distorted version of her own. "I am you. You'll never be free." Amanda clenched her fists, trying to push back against the overwhelming darkness that pressed in on her. She had to fight. She had to escape. But how? How could she fight something that was a part of her, that had always been there, lurking in the shadows of her own mind? Her mind raced, thoughts flitting like flashes of lightning in the storm of her panic. There was a way out. There had to be. She had to find it. Suddenly, a thought hit her, a memory, a distant whisper from the past. The mirror. The first time she had seen the reflection move on its own. There had been something she had missed. She hadn't understood it before, but now, in the depths of this nightmare, it was all clear. Amanda turned toward the nearest mirror, her reflection staring back at her with that same twisted grin. She reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it against the cold surface. The glass rippled beneath her touch, warping like water, distorting her reflection. "No," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "I am not you." With every ounce of strength she had left, Amanda pulled her hand away from the glass, backing up as the reflection reached forward, its cold fingers brushing against her skin. The reflection's grin grew wider, but there was something different now. There was hesitation in its eyes, a flicker of doubt. For the first time, it wasn't in control. Amanda could feel it, the shift in the air, the change in the power dynamic between them. It was afraid. "I won't let you win," Amanda said, her voice steady now, filled with a determination she hadn't known she was capable of. "I am me." The reflection snarled, its face contorting with rage as it slammed its hands against the mirror, its eyes glowing with malice. But Amanda was no longer afraid. The terror that had once held her in its grip was beginning to fade, replaced by something stronger, resolve. She stepped forward, placing her hands against the glass. The reflection snarled, twisting its face in fury, but Amanda could see through the anger. It was terrified. It knew that the power it had held over her was slipping away. With a final, desperate scream, the reflection lunged at her, its fingers reaching through the mirror, but Amanda was ready. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and pushed back with all her might. The glass shattered. For a split second, Amanda felt a sharp pain, as if the entire world was ripping apart around her. But then, everything went still. The mirrors, the darkness, the endless hallway, they all vanished. And Amanda found herself standing in her apartment again, gasping for breath, her hands trembling. The room was quiet, still normal. There was no reflection standing in the doorway, no twisted version of herself lurking in the shadows. It was over. She had won. Amanda sank to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion, her heart still racing in her chest. She was free, but as she sat there, surrounded by the silence of the apartment, something lingered. A feeling, a whisper at the back of her mind. She wasn't sure if she would ever be completely free of the reflection. But for now, in this moment, she had survived. She had faced the darkest part of herself, and had come out on the other side. Amanda slowly got to her feet, looking around the room one last time, the faintest smile curling on her lips. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew this: whatever came next, she could face it. She had faced the mirror, and she had won. Name of the next story: The Forgotten Room. Mark and Sarah had always dreamed of living in a grand old house, far from the noise of the city. So when they found the mansion at the edge of town, they knew it was the perfect place to begin their new life together. The house was massive, its stone walls covered in ivy, the windows dark and brooding. The real estate agent had said it had been abandoned for years, but everything seemed to be in order. It was cheap, too cheap for its size and location, and they couldn't resist. The house was old, but it had character. Mark loved the high ceilings, the long corridors, the creaking wooden floors that seemed to groan under every step. Sarah, though, felt an uneasy tug in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been waiting for them. It was like it had been expecting them to come, like it was waiting for something, someone. The first few days passed quietly. They unpacked, settled in, and started exploring the large, sprawling mansion. The rooms were full of old furniture, some covered in dusty sheets, others left open and untouched. It all felt so still, but there was one thing that Sarah couldn't quite explain. There was a room, tucked away at the end of a long hallway, that wasn't on any of the floor plans. She had noticed it the first day they moved in. an old, faded door at the very back of the house, its brass handle covered in years of dust. Sarah had walked by it several times, but Mark had never mentioned it. The door was locked, of course, but there was something about it that drew her in. The rest of the house felt lived in, albeit abandoned for a while, but this door, this room, felt different. It felt like it didn't belong. One evening, when Mark was at work, Sarah decided to investigate. She stood in front of the door, her hand hovering over the handle, and for a moment she hesitated. She had no reason to feel nervous. It was just another room in the house. But something in her gut told her that opening this door would change everything. She turned the handle. The door creaked open with a slow, heavy sound, like it hadn't been opened in decades. Inside, the room was eerily still. Dust hung in the air like a thick fog, and the heavy scent of old wood and decay filled her nostrils. The room was small, with only one window, its glass cracked and cloudy. There was no light, except for a dim beam of sunlight filtering in from the hallway. And yet, as Sarah stepped into the room, she felt the temperature drop sharply. The room was a time capsule. The furniture was old, antique almost, but there was something wrong about it. Everything was arranged as if someone had just walked out, but there was no trace of life left behind. A rocking chair sat by the window, frozen in place as if it had been abandoned mid-motion. On the far wall, an old wooden desk was piled high with papers, most of them yellowed and crumbling with age. But what caught Sarah's attention the most was a small, ornate mirror hanging on the wall above the desk. It was strange. Unlike the rest of the room, the mirror was pristine, its surface free of dust, the glass clear and shining. There was something about the way it hung on the wall that made Sarah uneasy. She couldn't explain why. The mirror seemed to watch her, its frame adorned with delicate carvings, the patterns almost too intricate to be real. As she walked closer, she caught her reflection in the glass. It was strange, almost too clear. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with curiosity, but there was something else. Something wrong. She blinked, trying to shake the feeling, but the reflection didn't move with her. It stayed still, locked in place, almost as if it was frozen in time. Sarah took a step back, her heart racing. She looked at the rest of the room again. It was as if everything was stuck. The furniture, the papers, the dust, they had all been trapped in time, caught in some strange moment, suspended between decades. Just then, she heard footsteps behind her. "Sarah!" Mark's voice called out from the hallway. Startled, Sarah turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. But there was no one there. The hallway outside the room was empty. She frowned and took a step back toward the door, but before she could reach it, a cold, dry voice whispered in her ear, so close that it felt as if it were coming from the mirror itself. "You shouldn't be here." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice wasn't Mark's. It was raspy, cold, and distant. She spun around, but the room was still empty. The mirror reflected nothing but her own wide-eyed face, staring back at her in fear. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the door, her mind spinning with confusion. The voice had been real. She knew it had been. But what had said it? She opened the door quickly, stepping into the hallway, and slammed it shut behind her. For a long moment, she just stood there, trying to steady her breath, her heart still hammering in her chest. "It's just the house," she told herself. "It's old. It's settling. I'm just tired." But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. When Mark came home later that evening, Sarah was still rattled by the encounter. She didn't mention the voice to him, though. She couldn't. How could she explain what had happened? How could she explain the feeling that the house was alive, that it had spoken to her? She had no answers. Mark noticed that Sarah seemed off, though. He could see the unease in her eyes, the way she kept looking over her shoulder, the way her hands trembled slightly whenever she picked up a glass or set something down. "Hey, what's going on?" Mark asked, sitting beside her on the couch as they ate dinner. "You've been kind of quiet today." Sarah hesitated. She wanted to tell him about the room, about the voice, about the feeling she had gotten. But something held her back. She didn't want to sound crazy. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. I don't feel right. There's something weird about this house." Mark smiled, trying to reassure her. "It's just an old house. You'll get used to it." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Something about the room, about that mirror, felt wrong. And the voice, it lingered in her mind, a constant whisper in the back of her thoughts. The days passed, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with the house. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the walls were closing in on her with every step she took. Each time she walked past that door at the end of the hall, she felt a strange compulsion to open it again, to see what else was hidden inside. But she resisted. Every time she tried to forget about it, that voice echoed in her mind. "You shouldn't be here." It was as if the house was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. The mirror in that room, it was always in the back of her mind. She couldn't explain why, but every time she thought about it, she felt the same chill of fear crawl up her spine. One evening, after dinner, Sarah found herself standing in front of the door once again. The dim light from the hallway barely reached the corners of the room, but she could still feel its presence. The door. She had to open it. Mark had gone to bed early that night, exhausted from a long week at work. Sarah knew this was her chance. She could finally figure out what was inside that room, why it had been locked away for so long. She reached out, her hand trembling as it grasped the cold brass handle. But just as she was about to turn it, she heard it again. The whisper. Soft, almost too faint to hear. "Don't open it." This time it was clearer, more urgent. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She pulled her hand away from the handle and stepped back, her breath shallow. The voice wasn't just in her head anymore. It was real. A flash of movement caught her eye, and she spun around, her pulse racing. The hallway was empty, but there was something new. The faintest outline of a shadow seemed to be lingering at the far end of the hall, near the staircase. It was too dark to make out, but it felt wrong, like something was there that shouldn't be. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back toward the door, but then she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Coming closer. She turned quickly, expecting to see Mark, but the hallway remained empty. The footsteps stopped. Sarah stood frozen in place, her heartbeat deafening in her ears. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, and she felt a cold dread crawl up her spine. Then she heard the whisper again. This time, it came from behind her. "You shouldn't have come back." A voice so close, so cold, that it sent a shiver through her entire body. Without thinking, she spun around, her heart racing. The room, the door, was slightly open. The air inside was thick with dust, and the dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the mirror, which now seemed to shimmer faintly in the darkness. Sarah's feet moved without her consent. She didn't want to go in, but something was pulling her forward, something stronger than fear. It was as if the house was calling to her. Step by step, she moved toward the door. The cold air rushed out of the room as she entered, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop. As soon as she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, sending a jolt of panic through her. She turned around quickly, her pulse racing as she reached for the door. But it was locked. The handle wouldn't budge. She pounded on the door, shouting for Mark, but the house didn't answer. She was alone. The room felt darker now, more oppressive. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and decay. Her eyes immediately darted to the mirror. It was still there, hanging above the desk, its surface reflecting nothing but the dim light. But now the reflection was different. It wasn't just Sarah anymore. The figure in the mirror was standing, its face twisted in a grotesque smile, its eyes hollow and empty. It was as if it had come to life, a ghostly version of someone long gone, a part of the room itself, trapped in time. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a reflection. It was something else. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror moved. Sarah gasped as the reflection smiled wider, its mouth stretching unnaturally. It raised its hand, as if beckoning her forward. The fingers in the mirror twitched and curled, its nails growing longer, sharper. In a blind panic, Sarah turned away, her body shaking with fear. She backed up against the desk, knocking over a few papers in the process. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror. The figure was still there, watching her, smiling that horrible, twisted smile. A cold gust of wind filled the room, making the papers scatter across the floor. The window, which had been cracked before, now opened wide, as if the house was letting in the air, or calling for something. Sarah took a deep breath and forced herself to look away. She couldn't stay here. With trembling hands, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, hoping to call Mark, to find a way out. But the screen was black, completely dead. There was no signal. She looked around the room desperately. There had to be a way out. She needed to get out of here before it was too late. But then she heard it, the whisper, louder now. Leave, and you'll be trapped forever. It came from all directions at once. The walls, the mirror, the floor beneath her feet. The voice was everywhere. Her hands shook as she reached for the door again. This time, the handle gave way, creaking open as if it had been waiting for her to leave. The room was dark now. The mirror had faded into shadow. The voice had stopped. But something was still there. Something watching. Waiting. Sarah rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She leaned against it, panting heavily, trying to steady her breath. The hallway was silent, but the house wasn't finished with her yet. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed her back against the door, trying to catch her breath. The silence that enveloped her felt suffocating, but she didn't dare move. She wasn't sure if it was the house itself or the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She could still feel the icy chill in the air, as if the room beyond the door was reaching out, trying to drag her back inside. A low creak echoed through the house, followed by another, then another. The sound of something heavy shifting, moving, grew louder. Sarah's pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. She never had been. Her mind raced as she fumbled for her phone, hoping against hope that somehow it would have a signal now. But it remained black, the lifeless screen mocking her desperation. She could hear the wind whistling faintly outside, rattling the windows, but there was no comfort in it. The house was alive, it seemed, its bones groaning as it shifted around her. She was trapped in a house that didn't want her to leave. Suddenly, the whisper came again, this time sharper, more insistent. You shouldn't have opened the door. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was coming from everywhere. It wasn't just in her head anymore. It surrounded her, like the very walls were speaking. Her legs trembled beneath her as she slowly turned around, expecting to see Mark coming down the hallway, but there was no sign of him. No movement, just the silence and the whispering. She looked at the end of the hall, her eyes straining in the dim light. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something darker, more rotten. The door to the forgotten room remained ajar behind her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it again. Not after what she had seen. Her breath caught as she noticed something else. At the far end of the hallway, there was a faint flicker of light, like the soft glow of a candle. She squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the hallway was empty. The light shouldn't have been there. Sarah took a tentative step forward, her feet dragging on the creaky floorboards. Every step felt like it took all of her willpower. The light grew brighter, more defined, until she realized it wasn't just a candle. It was the glow from the same ornate mirror that had haunted the forgotten room. But it wasn't the same mirror. The one in the hallway was different. Its surface was no longer smooth and polished. Instead, it shimmered with an unnatural dark light, as though something was trying to break through from the other side. The edges of the mirror seemed to ripple, distorting the reflection of the hallway. The air around it felt thick with something foul, as if the very essence of the house was bleeding into the space around her. Her hands trembled, but she couldn't stop herself. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on the mirror. In the reflection, she saw herself standing at the end of the hallway. But behind her, there was something else. Something moving. The figure from the room, the twisted, smiling one, was standing right behind her in the mirror. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest, and she whipped around, but there was nothing there. No one. The hallway was empty, but the mirror, the reflection, was still there. The figure smiled wider now, its face more distorted, its eyes hollow and empty. Its mouth stretched unnaturally, its lips curling into a grotesque grin that seemed to go on forever. Sarah stumbled back, her legs buckling under her as she fell to the floor. She tried to crawl away, but the air was suffocating, pressing in around her. The whisper grew louder, as if it was right in her ear now. "You can't escape." Her breath quickened. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The mirror, it wasn't just reflecting her. It was showing something else. Something that shouldn't be. And it was coming for her. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror reached out, its hands stretching toward her with a speed that defied reason. Its fingers, long, thin, and jagged, began to press against the glass, leaving cracks that spread like spiderwebs across its surface. With each crack, the room seemed to grow darker, colder, and the walls creaked louder, like they were groaning in pain. Sarah's head spun as she scrambled to her feet, her mind clouded with fear. She had to get out. She had to leave this house, leave everything behind. But the door to the front hall, was so far away. It felt like she was being pulled back, like the house itself was trying to keep her inside. The mirror flickered, then darkened entirely. For a moment, everything was still, and then bang. The sound of a door slamming echoed through the house, shaking the walls. Sarah jumped, her heart nearly stopping. The sound came from behind her. She spun around, her eyes wide. The door to the forgotten room was open, completely open. The whispering began again, this time louder, more frantic. "You shouldn't have opened it. Now it's too late." But Sarah couldn't stop herself. She moved toward the room, her feet dragging as if she was walking through thick mud. It was as though the house itself was pulling her in, demanding she face what was inside. The door creaked in protest as she stepped inside. The room was darker now, much darker. The only light came from the mirror, which shimmered faintly, its surface cracked and distorted. The air was cold, and the smell of decay grew stronger. But it wasn't the same room anymore. It had changed. The furniture, once still and lifeless, had shifted. The rocking chair by the window now rocked back and forth, as if someone were sitting in it, even though it was empty. The desk had been overturned, its papers scattered across the floor. And the mirror was now covered in deep, swirling cracks, its surface no longer reflecting the room at all. Instead, it seemed to show something else, a dark, twisted world, a place that felt ancient and wrong. Sarah gasped, taking a step back. She was trapped in this room. There was no way out. Then she heard it, the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably real. Someone or something was coming. She turned toward the door, but it slammed shut, trapping her inside. The room was sealed. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she backed away from the mirror, but it didn't matter. The figure was in it, and it was getting closer. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was loud, unmistakable, coming from everywhere at once. The walls, the mirror, the floor beneath her feet, all of it seemed to be alive with that voice. And then, as the figure in the mirror reached out to touch the glass, the room went black. The darkness was suffocating. Sarah's eyes flew open, but she could see nothing. Her body trembled with cold, the air in the room thick and damp. The whispering had stopped, but the oppressive silence only made her heart race faster, each beat like a drum in her ears. She was no longer sure if she was in the same room. Everything felt different, like the world had shifted, twisted in some unfathomable way. She reached out, her hand brushing against something cold and wet. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers slowly traced the surface, her hand trembling uncontrollably as she felt the familiar texture of the mirror's frame. But it wasn't right. The wood felt slick, almost as if it had absorbed something unnatural. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she realized the room had changed once again. The furniture was gone. The rocking chair, the desk, they had all vanished. There was no longer a sense of any room at all, just endless darkness, suffocating and empty, except for the mirror, looming in front of her like a gateway. She couldn't tear her eyes away. It was as if it was calling her, drawing her in. And when she looked into it, she didn't see her reflection anymore. Instead, she saw the hallway outside, but it was wrong. Distorted, twisted, as if viewed through a thick fog. The walls bent and warped, the lights flickering like candles in the wind, and shadows moved where there should have been none. Her breath caught. There was something else in the reflection. A figure, one she knew all too well. Mark. Her heart stopped for a moment as she took a step forward, her body paralyzed by shock. The figure in the mirror looked just like him, standing in the hallway, but his face was obscured by shadows. He seemed to be moving closer. No, this isn't possible. She took another step toward the mirror, her heartbeat growing louder with each breath. Mark couldn't be out there. He had to be back at the house, in the living room, asleep. But the figure in the reflection moved, its steps coming closer and closer, its presence ominously looming. "Mark?" Sarah whispered hoarsely, her voice barely above a breath. The figure in the mirror didn't respond. It just kept walking, its footsteps echoing through the darkness, until it was standing directly in front of the mirror. It looked at her. The shadows moved around his face, his eyes hollow, lifeless. A horrible, twisted grin spread across his lips. The very same grin she had seen on the figure that had appeared in the forgotten room. Her chest tightened. A scream lodged in her throat, but it couldn't escape. In the reflection, Mark's head tilted to the side slowly, almost as if he was studying her, waiting for something. The air around her grew heavier, colder. The shadows around him deepened, like they were feeding off the darkness of the house. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure in the mirror whispered, its voice low and rasping, but unmistakably Mark's voice. Her breath caught in her throat. No, this wasn't him. It couldn't be him. The figure in the mirror wasn't real. Her mind screamed at her to turn away, to run, to find a way out. But she couldn't. She couldn't stop looking at it. Then the figure, Mark's reflection, raised its hand to the glass, his fingers pressing against it, just as the figure in the forgotten room had done. The surface rippled under the pressure, as if the very fabric of reality was being pulled and distorted. And then it happened. The glass began to crack. A low sound reverberated through the room as the mirror fractured under the pressure, the cracks spreading like lightning. It sounded like something ancient, something wrong, as if the house itself was breaking apart. "Get away from the mirror," a voice screamed from behind her. Sarah spun around, her heart thudding in her chest. She wasn't alone. Mark was standing there, in front of her, wide-eyed, his expression terrified, his body trembling. He reached out to her, his hand extended, his mouth moving but no words coming out. "Mark?" she thought, but there was something wrong in his eyes. Something distant, unfamiliar. He didn't look like himself. The reflection in the mirror wasn't him. This was. The real Mark was right in front of her, but his body was distorted, almost translucent, as if he was fading in and out of existence. The room around them seemed to pulse, the walls breathing like something alive. "Sarah, we need to leave. We need to get out of here." Mark's voice was louder now, but it was filled with desperation. He grabbed her arm, his fingers ice cold. The reflection of Mark in the mirror moved again. The twisted figure, his smile growing wider, more monstrous. It reached its hand out from the glass, breaking through. "No!" Sarah screamed, jerking her arm away from Mark. She tried to back up, but her legs were shaking so much she could barely stand. The air grew thick with an unnatural pressure. The mirror, it was sucking her in, pulling her closer, as if it were a living thing. The sound of the mirror cracking continued, louder, sharper now. Pieces of glass began to fall to the floor, each one like a shard of the world being torn apart. Mark, her Mark, was standing right there, trying to pull her away, but it felt like he was slipping away, fading into the shadows. The figure in the mirror reached further, its hand nearly through the glass now. Sarah could feel its coldness, its presence growing stronger with each passing second. No, she couldn't let it take him. She couldn't let it take her. The reflection of Mark in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was alive, reaching for her, its smile widening, pulling her into the glass. Her breath was ragged, her body paralyzed in terror. "Sarah, no!" Mark's voice echoed louder now, almost frantic. Then suddenly the glass shattered. The sound of shattering glass pierced the air, a sharp, jagged noise that rattled Sarah's bones. Her eyes widened as the mirror exploded in a rain of shards, each piece flying toward her like tiny daggers. She ducked instinctively, shielding her face with her arms, but the glass didn't touch her. It stopped mid-air, hanging suspended for just a moment, before it fell to the floor, clinking and scattering like 1,000 tiny whispers. For a split second, the room went silent. Sarah stood frozen, her chest heaving with each frantic breath. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. The moment the glass had shattered, he had vanished. Gone, like a dream fading upon waking. The silence stretched, deep and unnatural. She spun around, frantically scanning the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner. Where was he? He had been standing right next to her only seconds before. He had been there, his cold fingers gripping her arm, his voice desperate, pleading for her to leave. But now he was gone. Her heart raced in panic. The room around her felt wrong, oppressive, the air thick with something malevolent. "Mark," she whispered hoarsely, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the faint sound of her own breath, echoing off the walls. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The reflection. The mirror was gone, shattered into pieces, but another mirror, this one large and old, its edges ornate with intricate carvings, had appeared on the wall. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. The reflection in the new mirror was different. The same hallway, the same dim lighting, the same twisted shadows, but now in the reflection she saw herself, standing alone in the center of the room. But there was something else, something off. Her reflection was smiling, a slow, cruel smile that didn't match her expression. Her real self was pale, panicked, eyes wide in terror, yet the figure in the mirror grinned, its smile stretching unnaturally. No, her breath hitched in her throat. She could feel the air growing heavier, suffocating, as if the house was closing in on her. She tried to step back, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was mocking her, its smile widening with every passing second. And then it moved. The reflection in the mirror tilted its head, just like Mark's had in the other mirror. But this time, the movement was slow, deliberate, as if the figure in the mirror was studying her, waiting for her to react. "What do you want from me?" Her mind screamed the question, but the figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out. Its hand moved through the mirror, its fingers stretching toward her. Each movement was unnatural, like the hand was being pulled by invisible strings. She tried to step back again, but she couldn't. Her body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around her was holding her in place, making it impossible to escape. The hand reached closer, closer still, its fingers inching toward her face. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a drum in the silence of the room. The moment it touched the surface of her skin, the cold was unbearable, freezing, biting like ice. The reflection's fingers felt real, solid. It felt like something was pulling at her, trying to drag her into the mirror, into its world. I can't let it take me. With every ounce of willpower she had left, Sarah forced herself to move. She screamed, throwing her arms up to push the hand away, but there was no substance to it. The reflection's hand was nothing but a shadow, a trick of the glass. Her pulse raced. The mirror, the reflection, the house, it was all connected, and it was feeding on her fear. It was feeding on her memories. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image of the hand reaching for her, but it was no use. She could still feel its coldness. The whispers had started again, low and distant at first, like the wind howling through an open window, then growing louder. You can't escape. The voice was familiar. It wasn't just in her head. It was in the air all around her. The walls seemed to echo with it, and then slowly the reflection in the mirror changed again. It wasn't her anymore. The figure in the mirror had morphed, twisted. It was no longer just a smile, no longer just a hand reaching out. Now, the figure in the reflection was wearing Mark's face. His eyes were hollow, the same grin stretched across his lips. But it wasn't Mark. It was something else entirely. It was smiling. Mark was gone. She realized it with a sickening clarity. The real Mark, the man she had known, the man who had been standing beside her moments ago, had never been here. Not in the way she thought. He was gone, and whatever was in the mirror had taken his place. No. Her heart seemed to stop as the reflection in the mirror reached out to touch the glass again, its long, cold fingers leaving smears on the surface. The whispers grew louder, louder than the pounding of her own heartbeat. It felt like the house was shaking, like the walls were closing in. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The reflection reached through the mirror, its hand pushing through, extending out into the room. You belong here now. The voice. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't anything she had ever heard before. It was cold, hollow. Her legs gave way. She collapsed to her knees, her arms trembling as she reached for the floor to steady herself. The world seemed to spin around her, the reflection moving closer, its hand stretching toward her face. You belong to the house now. You're ours. Sarah could feel it. Whatever was in the mirror was coming for her. She wasn't going to make it out. Not alive. Not the way she was. Her breath caught in her throat as the coldness of the figure's hand finally brushed against her skin. And in that moment, Sarah realized she was no longer in control. The house had won. The moment the cold fingers touched her skin, a shock ran through her body, a violent, electric pulse that left her gasping for air. Her heart hammered in her chest, faster and faster, and the room seemed to contract, the walls closing in around her. The coldness from the mirror spread through her veins, numbing her, draining her of all warmth and life. No, she thought desperately. This can't be happening. This isn't real. But the hand didn't pull away. It pressed closer, as though it were pulling her toward the mirror. She could feel herself being tugged, as if the glass were alive, pulling her into its depths. The world around her began to blur, her surroundings growing more and more distorted. "Stop!" she gasped, her voice breaking with panic, but the figure in the reflection, Mark's twisted image, only smiled wider. The room was sinking, the darkness swallowing her whole, and the last shred of reality she clung to slipped from her grasp. "I won't let it take me. I can't." The thought, desperate and full of fear, ran through her mind like a mantra. But every effort to resist seemed to drain her energy, to sap her strength. She reached out, her trembling hand touching the smooth surface of the mirror. For a moment, everything stopped. The house seemed to go still, as if holding its breath. Then, without warning, the mirror shuddered. The glass rippled like water, and with it, the air itself seemed to warp. The room was spinning now, as if it were being turned inside out, and she was falling. Falling through the mirror, falling into the reflection. Sarah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the cold, choking darkness that enveloped her. She was weightless, floating, and yet everything around her felt wrong, twisted. The sound of the whispers, the same low, sickening hum, had returned louder this time until it was deafening. She couldn't see, couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, trapped in a space that didn't exist, somewhere between worlds. The echo of her own name sounded, distant and hollow. Sarah. It was a voice she knew, but not from here. Not from this place. And then a flash of light. A brilliant, blinding flash that burned through the darkness, revealing a hallway. The same hallway. The one that had haunted her dreams. But now the hallway was different. It was longer, more narrow, and the walls seemed to shift, pulsating as if alive, breathing in time with her own ragged breaths. The air was thick with a musty, suffocating stench. It was as though the hallway had been trapped in time, frozen in a moment that had long passed. Was this the house she had moved into? She didn't know anymore. Everything felt foreign. The very ground beneath her feet seemed unstable, like it might collapse at any moment. She looked down, expecting to see the cold, hard floor, but instead, there was only darkness stretching beneath her, as though the hallway had no end. And then, through the mist, she saw them. Figures. Shadowy, indistinct shapes standing at the far end of the hallway. Watching her. Waiting. Her pulse raced again. No, she thought again, her mind screaming. I can't be here. This isn't real. But the figures were moving. Slowly, deliberately. They were coming toward her. Fear gripped her heart. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't obey. She could barely move. Her body was still trapped, frozen in place, as if the very air around her had become too thick to breathe, too heavy to move through. One of the figures stepped forward, its face obscured by shadows. It raised its hand, and in its fingers it held something small, shiny, and metallic. A key. The figure's hand reached out, holding the key toward her. The key gleamed in the dim light, its edges sharp and angular, as though it belonged to something ancient. Something old. The key to the room, she realized, the thought slipping into her mind like a forgotten memory. The forgotten room. She could feel the weight of it now, the memory flooding back. The feeling of being drawn to the door that shouldn't have been there. The sensation of something waiting for her inside. Something that had been waiting for decades. The figure's voice broke through the mist, a whisper that rattled her very bones. Come closer. Come and see what you've awakened. The words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice was gone. Her throat was too tight, as though the very air was suffocating her. Her chest constricted with each breath, and all she could do was watch as the figure drew closer. The hallway grew darker still, the shadows growing deeper, thicker, like living things. She could hear faint sounds now, scraping noises, soft whispers, like a dozen voices murmuring just out of reach. The temperature dropped, and she shivered violently, feeling the chill of the air penetrate her skin. The figure was close now, close enough that she could make out the shape of its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow, empty eyes. It was staring at her, as though it were studying her, waiting for something. Suddenly, the figure thrust the key forward, as if offering it to her. Take it, the voice whispered. Take it and open the door. Her mind screamed in protest. She couldn't. She shouldn't. Whatever was behind that door, whatever lay beyond it, she didn't want to know. But the key called to her. She could feel it. She could feel its pull. Slowly, hesitantly, her hand reached out, trembling with fear. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of the key, and for a brief moment, everything went still. The whispers, the shadows, the chilling air, all of it seemed to pause, holding its breath. Then, the moment she touched the key, everything changed. The moment Sarah's fingers made contact with the cold metal of the key, an electric jolt shot through her entire body. The sensation was like nothing she had ever felt, sharp, intense, and deeply unsettling. It felt as though the key was alive, as if it were pulling at the very core of her being. Her breath caught in her throat as the darkness around her seemed to pulse. as though it was reacting to her touch. Her heart thundered in her chest as the shadows began to shift again, swirling and stretching, growing darker, more oppressive. The air grew thick, heavy with a presence she couldn't quite name, but it was all around her, surrounding her, closing in. The figure, still standing in front of her, did not move. It simply watched her, its hollow eyes never blinking, never looking away. The grin on its face twisted slightly, as if amused by her hesitation. It held the key between its skeletal fingers, and Sarah felt her own hand tightening around it, her fingers closing instinctively, as if it were pulling her in. The whispers grew louder, the voices a cacophony of disjointed words, echoing in her ears. Some were angry, others were pleading, but all were laced with an unmistakable sense of longing, a hunger, a desperation for something. She couldn't make out the words, but the emotions were clear. Open the door. The words weren't spoken, they were felt, like a pulse that echoed in her bones. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, the fear wrapping itself around her heart. She didn't want to open the door. She didn't want to see what was waiting on the other side. But somehow, she knew she had no choice. She had to. The key was already in her hand, and there was nothing left to do but to follow through. Slowly, trembling, she turned toward the end of the hallway, her gaze drawn to the distant door. It was far away, but the more she looked, the closer it seemed to be. The door was old, ancient, even its surface covered in dust and decay. Its frame was warped, as if the passage of time had left its mark on it. The door itself was made of dark, heavy wood, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to move in the dim light, shifting like living things. The whispers grew louder as she approached, filling her ears with their insistent murmurings, and her heart began to race once more. Each step felt heavier, more labored, as if the house itself was trying to keep her from reaching the door. And yet, her hand remained locked around the key. The door seemed to grow larger as she drew nearer, its details more pronounced, the carvings more distinct. She could almost feel the weight of the past pressing against her. This was no ordinary door. It was something ancient, something tied to the very foundation of the house. With a shaky breath, Sarah inserted the key into the lock. It slid in with ease, and as she turned it, the sound of the mechanism unlocking was like a thunderclap in the quiet of the house. The door creaked open, the sound loud and jarring in the heavy silence. A cold gust of air poured out from the dark room beyond, carrying with it a scent that made her stomach churn. A mixture of mildew, decay, and something more, something worse. She hesitated, her body trembling with fear, but the pull was irresistible. She had to go inside. She had to see. With a final breath, Sarah stepped through the threshold. The room was small, suffocatingly so. The air was stale, and the temperature had dropped even further. The walls, lined with faded wallpaper, were peeling, the corners blackened with age. Dust hung thick in the air, settling on everything, making the room feel forgotten, abandoned for decades. But what unsettled Sarah the most wasn't the state of decay. It was the stillness. The room was completely still. No sounds, no movement. It was as if time had frozen inside this tiny claustrophobic space. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it. The furniture, old rickety chairs, a faded armchair covered in moth-eaten fabric, a tarnished silver mirror standing crookedly on the wall. The furniture was old, but it wasn't just old. It was frozen in time, as if it had been abandoned mid-use. The armchair, with its sagging cushions, seemed like someone had just risen from it. The glass of water on the small wooden table beside it still held droplets of condensation. And then the photographs. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The walls were covered with them. Black and white photographs, faded with age, their edges curled and worn. They were pictures of families, people smiling, their eyes wide and vacant. But the eyes, there was something about the eyes. They seemed to follow her, moving in the photographs as though they were alive, watching her with an unsettling intensity. She stepped further into the room, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The temperature was freezing now, and her breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. What was this place? She had to know. Her eyes scanned the room, her gaze falling upon an old, dusty rocking chair in the corner. The chair creaked, as if someone had just been sitting in it. The memory of it, the feeling of a presence lingering in the room, pressed against her chest like a vice. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, on a small wooden table, there was a box. An old, intricately carved box that seemed out of place. It was beautiful in a grotesque way, its surface covered in strange symbols she didn't recognize. The box was slightly open, as though someone had been rummaging through it just moments ago. Her instincts screamed at her not to touch it. "Leave now, Sarah," a voice whispered in her mind, soft but urgent. But she couldn't stop herself. She was drawn to it, the same way she had been drawn to the key. Something inside her urged her forward, step by step, until her hand reached out to touch the box. Her fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the box, and a sudden chill swept over her, as if the air had turned colder the moment she made contact. The room seemed to shift around her, the darkness pressing in tighter. Her heart began to race again, and the whispers returned, louder, more frantic, as though they were urging her to stop, to pull away from the box. But the sensation was overpowering. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was as if the box called to her, like a long-lost part of herself beckoning her closer. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering above the box, but her body moved on its own, the pull irresistible. Her fingers closed around the edge of the box, and she slowly lifted the lid. The sound of the lid creaking open was like a funeral bell, slow and foreboding. Inside there were items. Small trinkets, a tarnished locket, a faded letter sealed with a crimson wax emblem, a pair of old, weathered gloves. And at the very bottom of the box, buried beneath everything, was a photograph. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it. The photograph was important. It was as though it held the key to everything, the answer to the mystery that had been gnawing at the edges of her mind since she first stepped into this room. Her hand trembled as she lifted it out, the weight of it heavy, as though it carried the burden of years upon years of memories. The photograph was of a family, a woman and a man, both dressed in what could only be described as old-fashioned attire, 1920s perhaps. The woman had dark, piercing eyes that seemed to bore right into Sarah's soul, while the man stood behind her, his face obscured by shadows. But it wasn't their appearance that unsettled her, it was the background. The room in the photograph was unmistakably the same as the one she was standing in. The walls were slightly different, but the furniture was identical. The same worn armchair, the same crooked mirror, the same table with the strange box. It was this room, but in a time long gone. Sarah's fingers shook as she turned the photograph over. Written on the back, in faded ink, were words that sent a shiver down her spine. "I will never leave. I will never forget. I will always be with you, even after the end." A cold hand seemed to grip her chest. The words felt wrong. They felt as though they had been written not by someone in the past, but by someone in the present, someone here. She felt a presence in the room, a heavy, oppressive weight pressing in on her from all sides. The whispers were louder now, desperate, growing faster, almost like a chant. "It's time, it's time, it's time." Suddenly, the floorboards creaked loudly beneath her feet, as though someone was walking toward her, though no one was there. Her head snapped up in panic. The rocking chair in the corner, the one that had been empty just moments before, was now slowly rocking back and forth, the creak of the wood filling the silence. She didn't dare look away, but something made her glance at the mirror. Her reflection was there, but it wasn't her. It wasn't the Sarah she had known. The reflection was smiling, but it wasn't a smile of warmth or comfort. It was a twisted grin, stretched unnaturally wide, its eyes glinting with something dark. It raised its hand to the glass, pressing its palm against the mirror, and then it whispered, "Come back to me." The voice was low and cold, like the voice of someone who had been waiting for a long, long time. Sarah's stomach twisted. She dropped the photograph, the sound of it hitting the floor a loud crash in the silent room. But the whispers didn't stop. They were all around her now, coming from the walls, the ceiling, from the very air. "Come back! Come back! Come back!" The rocking chair's movement grew more frantic, the creaking louder, faster, as though something, was sitting in it, rocking with increasing speed. And then just as suddenly it stopped. The chair was still. No, 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 no. Her heart raced as she stumbled backward, her eyes darting to the door. She had to get out. She had to leave this room. She turned toward the door, but when she reached for it, her hand met only cold wood. The door was gone. The hallway was gone. The room had changed. It was no longer the room she had entered. It had become something else. The walls had shifted, the furniture had changed, and now there was no way out. The window was sealed tight, its glass frosted over, blocking any light from entering. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The temperature had dropped so much that Sarah could see her own breath in the air. The photograph, the one she had dropped, was now floating in the air in front of her. It rotated slowly, as if an unseen hand was holding it in place. And when it stopped, she could see the woman's face more clearly. Her eyes, those eyes, they were the same eyes as Sarah's. And then the whisper came again. Closer this time, a voice in her ear, cold and sharp. "You've been here before." Her breath caught. The air around her seemed to vibrate with the words, and she felt her body trembling, as though the ground beneath her was giving way. No, she hadn't been here before. She couldn't have been. She turned her head sharply, but the room, the house, was closing in on her. The walls were narrowing, pressing against her as if the very structure of the house was shifting, folding in on itself. And then, from the far corner of the room, she saw something that froze her blood. A figure in the shadowy depths of the room, standing motionless, just beyond the edge of the light. It was a woman, dressed in the same clothes as the woman in the photograph. Her eyes locked onto Sarah's with that same piercing, dark gaze. The air around her seemed to ripple, distorting as though time itself had fractured. And in the woman's hand, she held the very same photograph Sarah had just dropped. The woman's lips parted, and Sarah could hear the words before they were spoken. "Welcome home." Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the woman's gaze never leave her, those dark eyes following her every movement with unnerving precision. It was as though the woman knew her, as though they had shared a bond in a past that Sarah couldn't remember, but somehow knew she should. The whispering around her grew louder again, a chorus of voices, some pleading, some warning, filling the air, growing more frantic. But all Sarah could hear clearly was the woman's voice, calm and chilling, cutting through the chaos. "You've been waiting, Sarah." The name, her name, hung in the air, chilling her to the core. She had never spoken to this woman, never seen her before, yet somehow she felt an overwhelming connection, an undeniable sense of recognition. It was as if she had been drawn here for a reason, as if this moment was preordained, inevitable. "No," Sarah gasped, her voice shaking. I don't know you." The woman's lips curved into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was cold, cruel, twisted. "You've forgotten, but I remember." Suddenly, the room felt even colder. Sarah's skin prickled, a deep chill running through her veins as the woman took another step forward. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, but there was no other sound, no other movement. What do you want from me?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She wanted to run, wanted to escape, but her legs felt rooted to the spot, like she was being held in place by some unseen force. The woman's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark passing through them. She raised the photograph in her hand, holding it out toward Sarah. "You belong here." Her voice dropped to a low, sinister tone. This room, this house, it remembers you. It's waiting for you. Sarah's breath hitched as she glanced down at the photograph once more. It was the same as before, the same family portrait, but now the woman's eyes, those eyes, seemed to follow her in a way they hadn't before. It was as if the woman's gaze was no longer just in the photograph, but in the very room itself, watching her from all corners. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, her fingers brushing the edge of the photograph once more. She couldn't stop herself. The pull, the force drawing her toward it, was overwhelming. "Take it," the woman's voice commanded, her tone chillingly firm. "It's yours, Sarah. It always was." Her breath came faster now, panic rising within her chest. The walls seemed to be closing in again, the room constricting tighter with every passing second. She could feel the house breathing, the walls pulsing as if they were alive, as if they had a heartbeat of their own. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't belong here. I don't even know who you are." The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of something dark, something sinister. "You think you don't belong, but you've always belonged." Her voice was low, almost a growl now. "This room is yours, Sarah. This house is yours. You've been part of it for a long time, even before you knew it." The photograph in Sarah's hand began to feel heavier, as if something was pulling it down, weighing her hand, forcing her to hold it tighter. She looked down at the woman in the picture again, her eyes widening in horror as she realized something she hadn't noticed before. The woman in the photograph was smiling, but not like the smile she had seen earlier. No, this smile was different. It was full of darkness, full of a twisted, malevolent joy. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The house, the room, the strange pull she had felt from the moment she had stepped inside. It wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just a random, abandoned room. The room had chosen her. It had been waiting for her. She had always been meant to return. "You're mine now," the woman said, her voice a whisper of pure malice. "You've always been mine." The floor beneath Sarah seemed to shift, the room tilting ever so slightly. The walls began to close in on her, the pressure becoming unbearable. The temperature dropped to an icy chill, her breath freezing in the air. "No!" Sarah cried, her voice hoarse with fear. She backed away, trying to make sense of everything, but her legs were shaking so violently that she could barely stand. The photograph in her hand felt like it was burning her skin, like it was alive, pulling her in. Her mind raced, her thoughts a blur, but one thought stood out clearly. She had to get out. She had to escape. The woman, the room, the house, they weren't just haunting her. They were trapping her. But then a voice, her own voice, came from somewhere inside her head, a soft, insistent whisper that cut through the fear. "You're not who you think you are." The realization hit her like a wave crashing down. The memories, the ones she had buried deep inside her, began to surface, fragments of a life she had long forgotten. She had been here before, not just once, but many times. The house, the room, the woman, they had been waiting for her return, just as they had promised. The photograph burned her hand, the edges seeming to sear into her skin as her eyes glazed over. The figure of the woman stood still in the corner, her dark eyes watching with an almost sadistic glee. "Welcome home," the woman whispered one last time. And then, Sarah's reflection in the mirror grinned. The door slammed shut behind her. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, as if the very walls had drawn in close, sealing her fate. Sarah's chest tightened with an unnatural weight, her breath shallow and erratic. The photograph she still clutched in her hand felt hotter now, as though it were an inferno contained in a single fragile image. Her eyes burned as they traced the faces of the family in the picture once again. But this time she saw something different. The woman's smile was wide, unnaturally wide, too wide, and the man beside her, the shadowed figure, had eyes that glowed in the dim light, staring at Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the air. The rocking chair in the corner had begun moving again, this time faster, creaking violently as if something, or someone, was sitting in it, urging it to move. The whispers, so close now, seemed to come from all directions at once. "Come back! Come back! Come back!" Sarah's eyes darted to the door. It was still there, solid, unyielding, but the darkness behind it stretched, as if the room had grown deeper. The shadows under the door thickened, creeping along the floor like tendrils, searching, probing. Her heart slammed against her ribs as the temperature in the room plunged even further. She had to escape. She had to fight. "No, I'm not staying here. I'm not yours," Sarah screamed, her voice shaking with a force she didn't know she had left. Her grip tightened on the photograph, the edges cutting into her palm. She staggered backward, dragging her feet across the floor as she tried to reach the door. But the room was no longer just a room. It was an entity, alive, aware, and hostile. Suddenly, the photograph in her hand slipped, falling to the floor with a sickening thud. Her gaze dropped toward it, but before she could even move, a sharp pain shot through her chest, like icy needles piercing her skin. She gasped for air, clutching her ribs as if trying to hold herself together. The floor beneath her feet began to shift, the boards warping and bending, as though the very foundation of the house was changing. The walls groaned, their voices mingling with the whispers, louder now, desperate, urgent. "Come back! Come back! Come back!" Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as she fell to her knees, unable to breathe, her body shaking violently. The cold had taken root inside her, an invasive chill that threatened to consume her from the inside out. The house, it was suffocating her, drawing the very life from her with every breath. And then, as though answering her cry, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was the woman, the one from the photograph, the one who had haunted this room for years, maybe even decades. Her eyes glinted with something dark and terrible, and her smile stretched impossibly wide, almost tearing her face apart. "You're here," the woman said, her voice lilting and hollow. "You're back with me, Sarah. You always were." Sarah could only stare, horror creeping through her veins. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was as though the room itself had silenced her, swallowing her voice. And then, in a split second, the woman was gone. Vanished. Disappeared like smoke in the air. The room held its breath. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, with an overwhelming force, the house shook, the walls trembling as if something ancient, something powerful, was stirring beneath its foundation. The floorboards cracked loudly, the ceiling groaned under the strain. And through it all, the whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of voices, all calling her name. "Come back! Come back!" Sarah's eyes went wide with understanding. The room wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just a place where the past had left its mark. No, the house was alive. It had always been alive. And it had chosen her. It had waited for her. She wasn't just a visitor, not just someone who had stumbled upon this place. She was part of it, part of its history, part of its curse. She couldn't run. There was nowhere left to go. And then, as the house seemed to close in around her, she saw it. In the reflection of the shattered mirror, her own face stared back at her, but it wasn't her. It was the woman from the photograph. The woman with the wide, twisted smile. And as she watched, horrified, her reflection spoke. "Welcome home, Sarah." And that was when she understood. She had never left. She was always meant to stay. The room had claimed her. The house had claimed her. And now she was a part of it, trapped in time, forever bound to its walls. The door never opened again. The house was silent once more. But deep within its walls, the whispers never stopped. "Come back! Come back! Come back!" Name of the next story, The Gift of Silence. David sat in his dimly lit living room, the quiet of the evening pressing down on him like a heavy weight. He had been alone for several days now, ever since his wife, Clara, had left for her mother's house. He had gotten used to the silence, but tonight it felt different. It was deeper, somehow more oppressive. The air in the room felt thick, as though it was holding something back, something just out of reach. He glanced at the table next to him. There, on the polished wood, sat a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was unusual, beautiful even, with patterns that seemed to dance across its surface, shifting when he wasn't looking directly at them. He had received it earlier that day, a gift from a stranger, a man who had come to his door and handed it to him with a simple, cryptic message, a gift for you, for peace. David had accepted it without question. It wasn't unusual for people to send strange gifts sometimes, and it was certainly beautiful enough to keep. But as he studied the box now, a sense of unease crept over him. It was as if the box was waiting for him to do something with it, to open it. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the box. The patterns shifted again, almost as if they were alive, moving under his touch. With a hesitant breath, he lifted the lid. The moment the lid opened, a deep silence flooded the room. The kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything. The ticking of the clock on the wall ceased, the rustling of the trees outside stopped, even the faint hum of the refrigerator vanished. David froze, his heart beating faster, unsure of what was happening. His ears felt as though they had been stuffed with cotton, the silence suffocating him. He closed the box quickly, the world snapping back into its usual noise. The clock resumed its steady ticking, the trees outside began to rustle again, and the hum of the refrigerator returned. But the silence, it lingered in the back of his mind, a reminder of something that wasn't quite right. David stared at the box, his pulse quickening. What the hell was that? He muttered under his breath, but even as he spoke, he realized the sound of his voice was strangely distant. It was as if the words didn't come from his own mouth, but from somewhere far away. He shook his head, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had taken root inside him. "It's just a stupid trick," he said aloud, but again his voice sounded hollow, distant. He stood up, walking toward the window, hoping the night air would help clear his mind. The street outside was dark, quiet. The houses were all still, and no lights shone from the windows. It was an ordinary night, but the silence pressed on him, more oppressive than it had ever been before. The longer he stood there, the heavier it felt, until he couldn't take it any longer. He turned back to the table and stared at the box once again. He hadn't meant to open it again, but now it felt like he had to. It was as if the box was calling to him, urging him to understand it. With a deep breath, David reached for the box again. This time, when he opened it, the silence didn't just fill the room. It spread, creeping outward, until it consumed everything. The ticking of the clock stopped, the rustling of the trees outside ceased, and the hum of the refrigerator vanished. But there was more. His breath, his own breath, became quiet, muffled, as though even he was being swallowed up by the nothingness. David felt his heart pound harder in his chest. His eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The silence was no longer just something outside of him. It was inside him, inside his very thoughts, cutting off everything he knew. He couldn't hear his own voice in his head. He couldn't hear his heart. He slammed the lid shut, and the room snapped back to reality. But something was different. The silence didn't vanish completely. It lingered, a low hum that sat in the back of his mind, like the hum of an electric current waiting to surge forward. He stood there, breathing heavily, his mind spinning. The silence wasn't just something that had happened in the moment. It was spreading. It was beginning to take over. "What the hell is happening to me?" he whispered aloud, his voice barely more than a breath. But even as he spoke, he realized that the words he had just spoken were not his own. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't his thoughts. He looked at the box again. The lid was closed now, but he could still hear the faintest whisper, a hum, deep inside his mind. Slowly, hesitantly, he opened the box one last time. The silence poured out again, more powerful this time, drowning everything in its path. The sound of his breath, the beating of his heart, everything was gone. There was nothing left but the overwhelming, all-consuming quiet. And then he heard something. A voice. Faint at first, as if it were coming from far away, but then it grew clearer, sharper. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't anyone he recognized. It was cold, emotionless, distant. You asked for peace. David's skin prickled, a chill running down his spine as the voice echoed in his head. The box. The man who had given it to him. This wasn't just a gift, it was a curse. What did you do to me? David whispered, but even as he spoke, the words didn't seem to come from him. They weren't his. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. His vision blurred, the edges of the room fading in and out like the world itself was slipping away. He couldn't feel his body. He couldn't hear his thoughts. The silence was too deep, too complete. And then, as the silence stretched on, David realized with a sickening certainty there would be no end to it. He would never hear his own voice again. He would never hear anyone else's. The silence had erased him. David's eyes snapped open, but all he saw was the same emptiness, the same oppressive quiet that smothered everything around him. He was trapped, caught in a world where sound no longer existed, where even his own existence seemed to fade in and out of reality. His thoughts were the only thing left, but even those were beginning to slip through his fingers like sand. The silence had begun to twist them, erasing fragments of memory, blurring the line between what was real and what was imagined. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken to Clara, or even what her voice sounded like. He couldn't remember the warmth of her hand in his, or the sound of her laughter. Everything was slipping away, fading into the background of his mind like a forgotten dream. "Clara," he whispered, or at least he thought he did. The word barely left his mouth, barely formed. It was more like a thought that tried to take shape but couldn't. The silence around him seemed to mock him, as though the very air was conspiring against him, refusing to let him cling to his memories. His name, David. Was that his name? He wasn't even sure anymore. The longer he stayed in the silence, the less he felt like himself, like a shadow of the man he used to be. With a sudden jolt, he stumbled back, his hand reaching for the table to steady himself. But as his fingers brushed against it, he realized something. The table, the box, the room itself, they were fading, warping. The edges of the furniture blurred, becoming indistinct, as if they were not entirely real anymore. He staggered towards the door, but it felt far away, distant, as though the room had grown larger, more expansive, and the door was no longer a simple exit, but an unreachable destination. The silence had consumed everything, his world, his mind, his very essence. Then, through the haze of fading memories and distorted thoughts, he heard a faint sound. It was so small, so soft that he might have missed it if he hadn't been so desperate for something, anything, to break the silence. It was a voice, a woman's voice. David, his heart skipped a beat. Clara. It was Clara. It had to be. Her voice, faint but unmistakable. His name. Her voice was the only thing left that mattered, the only thing that could pull him from the brink of insanity. He pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the thump of his heart, still there, still real, still beating, even if the silence tried to take it away. "Clara," he whispered again, barely able to speak, as if the words were being stolen from him as soon as they left his lips. The silence made everything so much harder, so much more distant. But then the voice came again, closer this time, clearer. "David, please." His head snapped around, searching the empty space, the lifeless, quiet room. There was no one there, no sign of Clara. The voice had come from inside him, from the deepest corner of his mind. But how? How could it still be real when everything else had faded? When even his memories were slipping away like water through his fingers? "David," the voice repeated, this time accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible sound. The sound of breathing, not his own, someone else's. A faint, raspy breath like someone struggling to hold on to life. David's pulse quickened. He couldn't tell if the voice was real, or just another trick of the silence. But he had to find her. He had to find Clara. Frantically, he turned back to the table where the box still sat, as if waiting for him. He reached for it again, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the smooth wood, the silence tightened around him like a noose. He opened the box, and once again, the world around him was drowned in a deep, suffocating silence. But this time, something was different. The silence didn't just swallow everything. It was as though the silence itself was alive, pulling at him, tugging at his very soul. His breath caught in his throat. His heart was pounding in his chest, so loud in his ears that it was almost as if it, too, was trying to drown him in the quiet. But then, through the silence, he heard it again. David. This time, it was right behind him. The voice, soft, whispering in his ear, but when he spun around, there was nothing there. Just the darkness of the room, closing in on him. Clara? He gasped, but the sound of his voice felt distant, as if he was speaking from a place far, far away. David, you don't understand, the voice whispered again, more urgently this time. His head throbbed. The silence had infected his mind, gnawing at his thoughts, erasing everything he had once known. His memories were slipping away faster now, each second more fragile than the last. He opened the box once more, desperate for something, anything, that would break the hold the silence had on him. But all he felt was the coldness of the wood beneath his fingers, the overwhelming emptiness that surrounded him. He could feel his body trembling, his heart racing, but the silence, it was too much. And then, as if answering some unspoken question, the voice came again. But this time, it wasn't just Clara. It was many voices, soft, pleading, whispering all at once, until the room was filled with them, a chorus of desperate, mournful cries. David, please, help me. He clutched his head, trying to shut them out, but the voices only grew louder, more frantic. The silence was spreading, erasing everything around him, until there was nothing left but the relentless, suffocating chorus of whispers. But in the middle of it all, one voice stood out. David, you're the last. The voice was clear now, strong, full of terrible clarity. It wasn't Clara. It wasn't anyone he knew. It was something else. Something that had always been there, lurking in the silence. You're the last one. The silence will be your only companion now. David's breath hitched. His mind was slipping. He couldn't focus. He couldn't think. The silence was consuming him, and with it, his memories, his past, his life. All of it was being erased, one whisper at a time. The box was still in his hands, its lid open, as though daring him to do something, to fix what he had broken. But there was nothing to fix. The silence had already won. And slowly, as he stood there, surrounded by the endless whispers, David realized he had become part of the silence. It was as though David's existence had been erased, piece by piece, by the very thing he had once thought was a gift. The silence wrapped around him like a suffocating fog, pressing in on him from every side, until there was nothing left to feel, nothing left to hold on to. His fingers trembled, still clutching the box, but it no longer had any meaning. The weight of it felt hollow, as though it had no substance, no purpose. The voices, those many voices, continued to echo in his mind, their words indistinct, their cries fading in and out like a broken radio. Some were so close, it felt as if they were right beside him. Others seemed distant, lost in the vast emptiness. Yet, they all shared one thing in common. They were full of pain, desperation, regret. David, came the voice again, more insistent this time, cutting through the fog of silence. His heart lurched in his chest. He had heard it before, but this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It wasn't a memory. It felt real. He could feel it in his chest, in his bones, vibrating beneath his skin. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror, but still there was nothing. No figure, no person, just the oppressive quiet. But the voice, it came again, clearer now, sharp, like a needle prick in the silence. You cannot escape it, David. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. He clutched at his temples, as if he could hold his thoughts together long enough to understand. Escape it? Escape what? The silence had already taken so much. It had stolen the sound of his own voice. It had stolen the sounds of the world, the wind rustling outside, the hum of his refrigerator, the soft murmur of distant traffic. Everything was gone. Only the haunting whispers remained. David staggered backwards, his feet catching on the edges of furniture that no longer felt familiar. The room had shifted. What had once been his living room now seemed like an unfamiliar maze, the walls stretching and warping, twisting into shapes that no longer made sense. The corners were darker than before, shadows creeping where there should have been light. He closed his eyes, shaking his head as if trying to rid himself of the voices, trying to deny the reality that was slipping away from him. But the words kept coming. You can't run from it. You are the last. The words echoed in his mind, relentless, repeating over and over again. It was as though the silence itself was speaking to him, calling to him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. And then, as if on cue, the silence took on a new form. The walls around him seemed to contract, pulling inward like the walls of a collapsing tunnel. His vision blurred, the edges of the room growing indistinct, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was even still standing or if he had fallen into the darkness completely. The box, it was still in his hands, but it had changed. The smooth wood had become cold, jagged, as though it were made of broken stone. He turned it over, feeling the strange weight of it, and realized there was something new inside, something he hadn't seen before. With trembling hands, he pried open the lid once more. A small piece of paper sat inside, folded neatly. David felt his heart race as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the delicate handwriting. The words were written in ink, but they were fading, almost as if they were being erased by the same force that had taken everything else from him. To those who accept the gift, he read aloud, though the words seemed to barely leave his lips. The silence is not a curse, but a blessing. It will take from you what you do not need. It will leave only the truth behind. Embrace it, and you will be free. David blinked, his eyes watering. What did this mean? What truth? He didn't understand. The silence wasn't a blessing. It was taking everything. It was tearing apart his life, his memories. It was erasing the people he loved, the things he had once cherished. And then, as if the very room itself was mocking him, a new voice spoke. This one was louder, clearer, more solid than the others. You have no choice, David. David's heart froze. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command, a declaration. He whirled around, his eyes frantically searching for the source, but there was nothing. No one. Just the shadows closing in around him. His breath caught in his throat, his chest tightening as the silence pressed harder against him. The walls were now so close, so tight, he couldn't move. He was suffocating. The air was thick, stifling, as though the very room was pressing down on him, forcing him to listen, forcing him to understand. The silence is your master now, the voice said again, this time with a finality that made David's blood run cold. And that's when he realized he wasn't just being haunted by the silence. He was becoming it. The silence had taken everything, his voice, his memories, his identity. And now it was consuming him entirely. His thoughts were growing dimmer, fading into the void. His once clear sense of self was slipping away, replaced by the void, the emptiness that the silence had created. David dropped to his knees, clutching at his chest, trying to hold on to something, anything that would keep him grounded in reality. But there was nothing, no anchor, no way to fight back. The silence had already claimed him. And then a strange thing happened. A final, distant whisper reached his ears, clearer than all the others. Goodbye, David. It was Clara's voice. His eyes widened, his heart racing in his chest. But even as he struggled to hold on, even as he tried to call out to her, to find her, the silence swallowed him whole. And in that moment, David understood the true cost of the gift he had received. He had been given silence. The ultimate silence. A silence that took everything away, his past, his present, his future, and left him with nothing but the quiet. The unbearable, endless quiet. The silence that had erased him piece by piece. Now there was only the void, and David was gone. It was as though David's existence had been erased, piece by piece, by the very thing he had once thought was a gift. The silence wrapped around him like a suffocating fog, pressing in on him from every side, until there was nothing left to feel, nothing left to hold on to. His fingers trembled, still clutching the box, but it no longer had any meaning. The weight of it felt hollow, as though it had no substance, no purpose. The voices, those many voices, continued to echo in his mind, their words indistinct, their cries fading in and out like a broken radio. Some were so close, it felt as if they were right beside him. Others seemed distant, lost in the vast emptiness. Yet, they all shared one thing in common. They were full of pain, desperation, regret. David, came the voice again, more insistent this time, cutting through the fog of silence. His heart lurched in his chest. He had heard it before, but this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It wasn't a memory. It felt real. He could feel it in his chest, in his bones, vibrating beneath his skin. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror, but still there was nothing. No figure, no person, just the oppressive quiet. But the voice, it came again, clearer now, sharp, like a needle prick in the silence. You cannot escape it, David. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. He clutched at his temples, as if he could hold his thoughts together long enough to understand. Escape it? Escape what? The silence had already taken so much. It had stolen the sound of his own voice. It had stolen the sounds of the world, the wind rustling outside, the hum of his refrigerator, the soft murmur of distant traffic. Everything was gone. Only the haunting whispers remained. David staggered backwards, his feet catching on the edges of furniture that no longer felt familiar. The room had shifted. What had once been his living room now seemed like an unfamiliar maze, the walls stretching and warping, twisting into shapes that no longer made sense. The corners were darker than before, shadows creeping where there should have been light. He closed his eyes, shaking his head as if trying to rid himself of the voices, trying to deny the reality that was slipping away from him. But the words kept coming. You can't run from it. You are the last. The words echoed in his mind, relentless, repeating over and over again. It was as though the silence itself was speaking to him, calling to him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. And then, as if on cue, the silence took on a new form. The walls around him seemed to contract, pulling inward like the walls of a collapsing tunnel. His vision blurred, the edges of the room growing indistinct, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was even still standing or if he had fallen into the darkness completely. The box, it was still in his hands, but it had changed. The smooth wood had become cold, jagged, as though it were made of broken stone. He turned it over, feeling the strange weight of it, and realized there was something new inside, something he hadn't seen before. With trembling hands, he pried open the lid once more. A small piece of paper sat inside, folded neatly. David felt his heart race as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the delicate handwriting. The words were written in ink, but they were fading, almost as if they were being erased by the same force that had taken everything else from him. To those who accept the gift, he read aloud, though the words seemed to barely leave his lips. The silence is not a curse, but a blessing. It will take from you what you do not need. It will leave only the truth behind. Embrace it, and you will be free. David blinked, his eyes watering. What did this mean? What truth? He didn't understand. The silence wasn't a blessing. It was taking everything. It was tearing apart his life, his memories. It was erasing the people he loved, the things he had once cherished. And then, as if the very room itself was mocking him, a new voice spoke. This one was louder, clearer, more solid than the others. You have no choice, David. David's heart froze. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command, a declaration. He whirled around, his eyes frantically searching for the source, but there was nothing. No one. Just the shadows closing in around him. His breath caught in his throat, his chest tightening as the silence pressed harder against him. The walls were now so close, so tight, he couldn't move. He was suffocating. The air was thick, stifling, as though the very room was pressing down on him, forcing him to listen, forcing him to understand. "The silence is your master now," the voice said again, this time with a finality that made David's blood run cold. And that's when he realized he wasn't just being haunted by the silence. He was becoming it. The silence had taken everything, his voice, his memories, his identity. And now it was consuming him entirely. His thoughts were growing dimmer, fading into the void. His once clear sense of self was slipping away, replaced by the void, the emptiness that the silence had created. David dropped to his knees, clutching at his chest, trying to hold on to something, anything that would keep him grounded in reality. But there was nothing, no anchor, no way to fight back. The silence had already claimed him. And then a strange thing happened. A final, distant whisper reached his ears, clearer than all the others. "Goodbye, David." It was Clara's voice. His eyes widened, his heart racing in his chest. But even as he struggled to hold on, even as he tried to call out to her, to find her, the silence swallowed him whole. And in that moment, David understood the true cost of the gift he had received. He had been given silence. The ultimate silence. A silence that took everything away, his past, his present, his future, and left him with nothing but the quiet. The unbearable, endless quiet. The silence that had erased him piece by piece. Now there was only the void, and David was gone. The silence that had claimed David grew thicker with every passing second. It stretched endlessly, pulling him further into the abyss. His hands, once so steady, now trembled with the weight of his own thoughts. If thoughts could even be considered his own anymore. He had been a man who once spoke, laughed, and loved. A man who had once heard the world around him in all its sounds. The bustling streets, the chatter of friends, the whispers of his loved ones. But now there was nothing, nothing but the silence. And with it, he was fading. His sense of self, once solid and clear, had been chipped away like a fading memory, each piece of him eroded by the same force that now trapped him in this limbo. The silence was his only company now. It was his only truth. His hands, clutching the now ruined box, were the last reminder of what he had once held. The box, too, was beginning to change. The smooth wood had splintered into jagged edges, the carvings on its surface now worn and distorted, as if it had aged centuries in mere moments. It no longer felt like a gift. No, it felt like a tombstone, marking the end of something, marking the end of him. Somewhere, deep in the folds of his fading consciousness, David could feel a sliver of regret. If he could still feel anything, that would have been it. The regret for ever opening the box, for ever accepting the silence that had promised him peace. But peace had never been its true gift. Peace had been a lie. And now, as the last remnants of his identity were swallowed by the silence, David understood. The silence had not only taken his voice, it had taken the very core of who he was. The box, the silence, it was all part of a far darker plan than he could ever have imagined. It wasn't about taking away the noise, the sound, or the chaos. No, it was about erasing him entirely. And as the final threads of his existence snapped, the box closed of its own accord, the lid coming down with a soft, final click. The silence remained, stretching into eternity. It was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the absence of everything. Of time, of memory, of life. And in that silence, David was no more. The house was quiet, still, a place where memories once lived, now drowned in the eternal quiet that had claimed David. The door to his apartment stood ajar, but no sound could escape. There were no echoes of footsteps, No murmur of conversation, only the quiet. Days passed, weeks perhaps. No one could say for sure. Time had no meaning here, not anymore. The apartment remained unchanged, save for the dust gathering on the corners of the room, the slow decay of once cherished objects. And in the corner, where David had once sat, there was only a box, a beautifully carved box. And as the light shifted, it seemed to glint in a way that almost suggested waiting. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.